Okay, Council Chair, we are now live.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kenyatta Johnson, Councilman for the 2nd Councilmanic District, Chairman of the Special Committee on Gun Violence. This meeting is now called to order. I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We are using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Enquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings and can also be found on phlcouncil.com. Will the clerk please call the roll to take attendance? Members that are in attendance will indicate that they are present by signifying by saying aye. Also, please say a few brief words that when responding so that your image will be displayed on the screen when you speak.
Councilmember Squilla.
Present here today for the Special Committee on Gun Violence Prevention hearing.
Councilmember Gautier.
Present. Good morning. Excited to be here for this very important discussion.
Councilmember Dom.
Good morning, everyone. Present.
Councilmember Green.
Good morning, President. Thank you, Councilmember Johnson, for your leadership for yesterday's rally and today's hearing and tomorrow's hearing.
Councilmember Ginn.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning to the public. Thank you, Councilmember Johnson, for this important hearing.
Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Good morning, colleagues, and good morning, Councilman Jones, for calling and for standing up on this issue over and over again. We thank you so much for your leadership.
Councilmember Thomas.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, public. Thank you, Councilman Johnson, for your leadership on this issue as I'm looking forward to discussing solutions. Thank you.
Councilmember Sanchez.
Good morning, folks.
I believe that's all members present, Councilman Johnson.
Thank you very much. A quorum of the committee is present and this hearing is now called to order. This is the public hearing of the Special Committee on Gun Violence regarding Resolution 170609. Will the clerk please read the title of the resolution?
Resolution 170609, authorizing the creation of a Special Committee on Gun Violence Prevention to address Philadelphia's enduring plague of gun violence by facilitating coordination among stakeholders and formulating a comprehensive gun violence prevention strategy.
Before we begin to hear testimony from the witnesses we have for today, everyone who has been invited to the meeting to testify should be aware that this public hearing is being recorded. Because the hearing is public, participation and viewers have no reasonable expectations of privacy. By continuing to be in the meeting, you are consenting to being recorded. Additionally, prior to recognizing members for the questions or comments they have for witnesses, I will note for the record at this time that we will use the chat feature available on Microsoft Teams to allow members to signify that they wish to be recognized. In order to comply with the Sunshine Act, the chat feature must only be used for this purpose. I called this hearing today with a heavy heart. I've had a lot of sleepless nights this summer. We are not only in a health crisis and an economic crisis, we are in a gun violence crisis. Our streets are stained with blood. More than 5 people a day are shot in Philadelphia. The city has seen over 1,900 shootings and over 250 killings this year, more than half in all of the year of 2014. Over 100 children have been shot in Philadelphia in 2020. 7-year-old Zamar Jones died last week after being shot in the head as he played on his perch. This is not normal. This is not normal. We cannot let it be normal, and I will not let it be normal. To be clear, the city is not sitting on its hands. I am proud that since establishing the Special Committee on Gun Violence in 2017, We have worked with Mayor Kenny to establish an Office of Violence Prevention with a full staff. We have established the city's first citywide comprehensive violence prevention program. We have put 64 crisis intervention workers on the streets 7 days a week using the Cure Violence public health approach. We have funded millions in community grants to nonprofit on the ground boots organizations. We are in the early stages of a citywide rollout of group violence intervention, another proven evidence-based approach. But we must do more. We must do it better. We must do it more quickly. We must do it with more urgency. We are here today to talk publicly about what we are doing, the challenges created by the pandemic, and the solutions available to all of us. It will not be easy. We have to work hard and together, most importantly, to address the simple gun violence that we're seeing here in the city of Philadelphia. At this particular time, I'd like to call on my colleague, Councilman Jones, who's also co-chair of the Special Committee on Gun Violence, to provide opening remarks.
Councilman Johnson, this is Samantha. Councilman Jones is not on yet, but he will be on shortly.
Okay, well, at this particular point in time, we're going to move forward, allow Councilman Curtis Jones to make remarks when he joins the hearing. But at this time, I'm going to ask for the clerk to please call the panel, the first panel, please.
Larry Krasner and Danielle Outlaw. Councilman, you can invite the witnesses to begin their testimony whenever you're ready.
Commissioner District Attorney Larry Krasner, could you please begin your testimony?
Thank you. I have had the pleasure of testifying many times before with Commissioner. I know that she has a lot of details, so I would like to make sure to save her sufficient time to give her presentation. But having said that, I think I can complete my comments rather quickly in about 8 minutes, if it is acceptable, because I do have another obligation. Commissioner, I would like to go first.
Sounds good. Thank you. Kevin, if you could give the screen back to the DA. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And I will keep this obligation to confine my comments to about 8 minutes. So I have reviewed the questions that were presented.
Here we go. We're cooking with gas. Perfect.
And everyone, please mute their phones, please.
Those questions include what factors have contributed to the ongoing spike in gun violence, both.
Not you, Larry.
Oh, sorry. I apologize.
It's all right.
I have reviewed the questions that were presented. I just want to run through them real fast so people understand the basis for the comments. Number one, what factors have contributed to the ongoing spike in gun violence, both before and after COVID-19? Number two, how has COVID-19 affected your violence prevention and response efforts? Number three, how have FY21 budget cuts affected your violence prevention and response efforts? And four, how have you adjusted strategically and operationally to account for these COVID-19 and budget changes? Many of these are items we've spoken about previously, but let me make sure I cover them if I may. Number one, what factors have contributed to the ongoing spike in gun violence pre and post COVID-19? There is a long-term and there is a short-term answer to this. In the long term, there is no question that poverty and racism in this city, which are twin evils and are interconnected, have contributed greatly to violence in this city. This is a city that has had a chronically high rate of violence, obviously a terrible spike at this time. Simply put, poverty equals bullets. And if you put the map of violence over the map of poverty, you're looking at the same map. Number two, we have broken trust. There is a broken trust between the community and prosecutors. And I say that as the chief prosecutor. There's a broken trust between the community and police. Much of it has to do with a sad history, frankly, of how people in communities have been treated. Things like illegal stop and frisk, the convictions of innocent people, etc., have diminished that trust, and that diminishes the willingness, the likelihood of people coming forward to testify. One of the greatest problems we have as prosecutors and police have in investigating these matters is that a lot of witnesses or potential witnesses do not trust. and therefore they will not participate. The consequence of this, of course, in the long run, has been that there are low clearance rates. And I say that not to point, because my office is currently collaborating with the police department at the invitation of the commissioner on joint efforts to improve those clearance rates. But there is no way to look at a situation where in certain neighborhoods where there's a high level of gun violence and you have clearance rates for shootings that are on the order of 20%, clearance rates for homicides that hover around 50% and often are below it. There's no way to look at that and say that that's as good as we can do. We can all do better together, and I am committed as DA to working closely with police to improve those clearance rates. If we look at the budget and how we have gotten to this budget over decades, we have a budget where almost $1 billion is spent on traditional law enforcement efforts, and I'm including my office's budget. And yet we have a few $1 million that are put into violence prevention. Well, I guess you already know it's not working. And I say that as someone whose budget is on that chopping block. We have to think about divesting in things that don't work. And if some aspects of traditional law enforcement don't work, we have to think about things that actually do work in terms of investment in the way it has worked in other cities. And simply put, what that has been tens of millions of dollars invested in the right community-based organizations for many years. And those are the cities where you see both a decline in the crime rate and a decline in the jail population, which further funds the efforts to work with community-based organizations. That has to be part of our solution. If we look at the pandemic, stepping away from some of the long-term issues to the pandemic, we see that we're in a time when there are fewer witnesses on the street, businesses are closed, people are traveling less. The ones who are not risk takers wear masks and stay home for the most part. And yet the people who are on both sides of the gun are the biggest risk takers we have. So I guess it should not be a surprise, even though honestly it did surprise me. It should not be a surprise that groups and individuals involved in gunplay are out and about, while the people who might watch them, see them, report them when they're lurking, when they're hiding, when they're waiting for each other, are not there. That is a problem. It's not my opinion. It's the opinion of a lot of police officers as well, with whom I've spent some time. Policing is different now, and that is no bad reflection on our police commissioner. I think our police commissioner is doing everything she possibly can. But there have been times when, because of a fatal pandemic, the method of policing has had to change. For example, pushing forward for immediate prosecution only the most serious cases. And in my office, frankly, like it or not, we're almost at a standstill because the courts have been closed for 3.5 months. Once again, no one's fault. It is a pandemic. But when the traditional tools in the toolbox are not available, or at least some of them are not available to the police and to the prosecution, it's a problem. Consider this, for example. Probation department has effectively been shut down for months, not seeing people who are supervised, not even seeing them, at least for significant periods of time, by phone. There was a moment, it is my understanding, when the probation department was not even checking its voicemail. Imagine that level of supervision in the most supervised city in the country. Imagine that level of supervision when you're talking about people who have the potential to engage in violent activity and gun violence. It is a bad situation. And so it is a challenge that we are up against. How has it affected our violence prevention and response efforts? Well, I'll just give you one example. Our CARES program, which does what it can to serve the needs of families who have suffered loss in a homicide by dealing with them for 45 consecutive days, has to do an awful lot remotely. And those families are going to funerals remotely. It is indeed an impediment. How have the budget cuts affected our violence prevention response efforts? To be strictly honest, we haven't let it affect us yet. We deployed people all around the city, 2 ADAs per 6 divisions, so that's 12 people, and it is likely we will deploy another. We'll be at 18 of our attorneys all around the city in order to work collaboratively, and I think we're working so far very effectively with the police department to assist with gun violence issues specifically, and we're not coming back looking for more money. It hasn't affected us that much yet, and I would like to think and hope that the city and also all of you council members are sensitive to the reality that we can't function with any kind of a cut. We can shift, we can move, we can stretch, but we cannot break. And how have we adjusted strategically? Well, we are shifting because of the reality that Courts are closed and are in a reopening mode, and there's quite a bit of discussion back and forth, quite a bit of work with the defender, with the courts, with the DA's office to figure out this new world of remote courts. Because of that, we are adjusting strategically. We are moving people from one unit to another. As you can tell, we're deploying even more people to be out in the police divisions to work collaboratively with the police department. And we are looking at many other solutions within the office. This is a challenge for all of us. But I want you to know that I am honored that you gave me the chance to speak to you about this. I am your partner in every way possible, because the reality is we cannot have any more Zamar Joneses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, District Attorney Larry Krasner. I just want to take a moment of councilmanic privilege to acknowledge Chairman, Co-Chairman, Councilman Curtis Jones to give his brief remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for the technical difficulties of getting online. We managed to overcome that. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being a laser beam on this subject. Calling this emergency meeting was truly appropriate after the last several weeks we've had. Many of the members on this call have been co-victims of some of the murders in the city of Philadelphia. We call each other, we support each other in ways that is like family being lost, because they are. I will share just a quick story and then get to the point. D.A. Krasner, myself, Representative Cephas, about almost 2 months ago now, walked around my district in some of the hot spots. And we were looking at ways to be more impactful, to be more intentional in our limited resources that we have to combat this issue. And one of the stops was Simpson Street. I think it might have been our second to last stop. And we were walking down the street and we were looking at troubled homes that were suspected of being centers of criminal activity. And we were talking to residents who were damn glad to see us at least showing up. You always talk about it, Mr. Chairman. Half of the battle is showing up. And when we got to the end of the block, there was a grandmother at the end of that block who pulled us a little to the side so she could not be seen by the other neighbors and said, if you want my advice, you burn down this whole block. We thought at the time she was just being protective of her two grandkids. Little did we know she was, because after, on that same block, Zamar was murdered, we came back to that block for the memorial. You were there, as well as many other members of council. And that grandmother came back up to me and said that was her grandson that was murdered. I'm going to show you statistics, but none of those statistics will equal what we felt, all of us felt that day, from the DA to all of the members and to the residents of that community. Because whatever these statistics, whatever, this is systemic racism, hearts and prayers and minds, and, all of that doesn't equal that grandmother's pain. So if you would allow me, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to show you a couple of charts, and I'll be brief. Sam, are you there?
Yes, I'll pull them up right now.
So to talk about the problem here is that we have had 259 homicides year to date, which is up 31% as to the same time last year. We've had 1,891 shooting incidences. The popular method of shooting now is, I'm gonna shoot you in the leg and hope you don't die. That's up 55% from last year. There's 1,139 shooting victims. That's up 36% from last year. Now, if us as elected officials could not perform our job, whether it's fixing potholes or fixing schools, to that degree, we'd be fired. We'd be unelected. We'd be a failure. We need to look at this and say, I know the causes, what are the solutions? Go to the next slide. So Simpson Street, I mentioned, where Zamar was murdered. If all of these programs are supposed to be data-driven, the data was slapping us in the face about Simpson Street. Remember, Gilmore Richardson always talks about your longevity shouldn't be based on your zip code. Talked about it in our campaign, and it's stuck in my head because it is true. But what is also true is that if you're in the insurance business and you do actuarials, they look at maps like this and they say, how old is the potential person to be insured? What is their projected life expectancy living in that zip code? What is their profession? How well are they educated? And then they do a calculation as to their prospects of life. And then worse, they place a value on what that life is worth. So on that block, in the past 5 years, on one block, we've had 3 homicides. We had 11 shooting victims. We had 23 robberies with firearms, 33 aggravated assaults with firearms, 16 shooting incidences. So I don't know what the calculations are and how we're supposed to sociologically consider all of the factors. But if you look at that from the lens of a insurance broker or the lens of a mother, that's a dangerous block. And whatever resources, through whatever programs you want to call it, you could call it Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, all I care. And I don't care who gets the credit for it. But we cannot let that grandmother's loss go unheeded. Next slide. So when we talk about the various programs, it starts, for me, in your district, Member Johnson, when you did Focus Deterrent. And there are many different critiques of that program. Some people say, it was a rousing success. Some people may say it cost too much. But if it saved lives, if we're not insurance brokers putting a price tag on Zamir Jones's life, then his life, to me, is priceless. If you look at what happened in Jamie's district, my district, other districts, Germantown and others, how much is a life worth? Is it worth as much as a bike lane? How many deaths were due to, and I'm not trying to say or, I'm trying to say and, but how many people died compared to gun violence in the city on bikes? Yet we are not dollar for dollar matching that kind of expenditure for at least 3 kids that were shot in the last 7 days. So whether you take, all of these programs are supposed to be tailored to the geography in which they find themselves. South Philly is not West Philly. West Philly is not the Northeast. or Kensington. But we need to take components that work to create solutions that are necessary in our respective districts. And as the DA said, we got to put our money where our mouth is. Pound for pound, dollar for dollar. If I say this all the time, and I'll close with this, if 3 whales washed up on the shore of the Delaware or the Schuylkill, every marine biologist in the world would be taking tissue samples and water samples to find out why. Over 100 of our babies were shot this last year, and we're not putting the same effort we would do for whales and bike lanes. We can do better, we will do better, and we serve a notice today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman Jones. At this time, I'm going to ask for, I want to acknowledge first and foremost, I want to acknowledge Kendra Brooks and Councilman Cindy Bass, who are also present. And at this time, I'm going to open up for questions for District Attorney Larry Krasner.
This is Councilwoman Sanchez. Thank you, DA Krasner, for your willingness to roll up your sleeves and do whatever is necessary as we are unprecedented times. If you had to say what we need to do immediately as it relates to the court system, what would be your recommendations 1, 2, and 3? And again, I give this space a little to my Councilman Jones, who is a member of CJAB. The reason CJAB exists is for us to be able to have a coordinated response. And people don't want to hear that the courts are not open. People want to hear that we're prosecuting and we're getting people in jail who need to be in jail as we work to releasing those who don't need to be there. So 1, 2, 3 things that need to happen immediately for us to get that court going. And I am of the belief that the court system has not been held accountable. We are seeing it in the eviction process. We're seeing it everywhere else. And I want to know what this council can do immediately to, outside of our budget discussion, because we will have that too as chair of appropriations. But what do we need to do immediately to get this moving? Thank you, DA.
Thank you for that question, council member. Very quickly, perhaps the most important issue right now, because even when the courts reopen, it's not going to be full effect right away. It's going to be a gradual process. But right now, we have a tremendous issue with bail, and I don't say that to say that there's anything council can do right now, but we have a tremendous issue with bail in the sense that there are still some people, although fewer, thankfully, who are stuck in jail just because they are too poor on minor offenses. But most importantly, in relation to gun violence, what my office is seeing, and I say this respectfully to an independent court system, what my office is seeing is that bails are too low, and often too low on cases involving shootings, on cases involving felons in possession of a firearm. My office is fairly consistently seeking a relatively high bail, $999,000, which actually only takes $30,000 to pay, but we are seeing that, we are seeking that, and we are not getting it. And my preliminary data indicates that for shooting cases and for gun violence cases where we have sought a high bail because we consider that person to be truly dangerous, we are seeing that about half of those people are out fairly quickly. We are not getting the bails that we seek. We share the defender's belief that there should be full hearings, at least on cases like that, in front of judges. And by judges, I mean bail commissioners are not exactly judges. Some of them are not even lawyers. And I don't say that to be disrespectful, because some of them are wonderful people. But in many other jurisdictions, you have a full bail hearing on a serious case within a couple days. And that includes Washington, D.C., where they have no cash bail. That's not happening here. So there needs to be an improvement in the bail situation where some of the broke, poor people in the non-serious cases are out. And those places are occupied by people who are truly dangerous to the community and endanger not only everyone else, but endanger themselves. The second thing is that during the court reopening, we are really going to have to move ahead, there's going to have to be some grasp, understanding, and serious engagement with technology, because a certain amount of this can be done technologically. I can tell you that we are working closely with judicial leadership. We're working closely with Rich McSorley, who has just been appointed to be in charge of such things. We are exchanging ideas with the defenders, as always, and we're hopeful that we're going to have a decent plan moving forward. But it's tough. I mean, these are unprecedented times. In my 33-year career as an attorney, when I was in the CJC or City Hall consistently, we've never seen the courts closed for more than a few days, and it's been 3.5 months. I can tell you this. I am happy to give you more specific proposals as early as around Labor Day, once we see what it is the courts actually intend to do. Much of this is under their control. And the third thing would be probation really needs to be supervising the most dangerous people out there. I don't know what their status is right now, but I can tell you that there was a moment when there was no reporting. There was not, from my understanding, even checking of voicemails. That's just not something that we can do in the middle of a gun violence crisis. There has to be a better approach to that.
Thank you very much, District Attorney Larry Krasner. And you hit something that was the nail on the head, specifically around the issue of probation and parole and the lack of supervision, which also plays a role in those who are most violent and those who are shooters to have the opportunity to run freely in the streets without supervision, without getting their urines checked, without overall being supervised. So thank you for touching on that aspect. Give me one recommendation as relates to, I know you talked about the rebuilding of trust with the District Attorney's Office as well as the Philadelphia Police Department, but let's stay focused on the District Attorney's Office. Give me one recommendation that will help build the trust with the DA's office, and also parlay that into specifically your approach on prosecuting those who are carrying guns. There is no, we've discussed this before, this has been mentioned before, a lot of the talk in the streets. Separate from me being an elected official, I'm a guy that actually works in the streets with a lot of young guys, and I get the buzz that guys get locked up for gun charges without fear of being fully prosecuted, because they know there's some technicality, some way that they're going to get off. So give me an idea of a recommendation of how your office approaches that issue of prosecuting those who carry guns, but also how can we improve and recommend recommendations in terms of their trust building between the District Attorney's Office and members of the community.
So thank you, Council Member. Very quickly on the trust issue, that's something we have been on for over 30 months now. The reason you exonerate an innocent person to get them out of jail is to show that you mean business about trying to be fair. The reason you take unpopular positions that are legally correct is to show that you are trying to be fair. And I will say this, one thing that I think this office can be duly proud of is when we walk around the streets, which I do as well, of course, Council Member, is we hear people over and over and over say you are trying to be fair. The reason they're saying trying is they are used to prosecutors who don't even try. They don't expect us to be perfect, but they do expect us to try. Now, in terms of building trust, of course, we are also working with the Philadelphia Police Department, and I know that this commissioner is dedicated to accountability within the police department, and that she's going to have, frankly, she's going to take some heat on that, because we've been taking some heat on that too. But we stand ready to assist and to partner in terms of making sure that there's an even-handed application of justice. Going to your question about the prosecution of guns and the prosecution of shootings, what has been going on here actually is that we brought a higher level of gun cases, meaning a higher percent of them than a prior administration. And we are in the process with the police department of looking carefully at the cases that have not made it to the finish line. You always have some cases that don't make it to the finish line, but we need to know why. So we are looking at those cases, and I can tell you we are currently engaged in a review of about over 400 cases where certain issues came up to find out what it is. Some of those issues I think can be remedied within this office. Some of those issues are joint issues with the police department. And we have spoken about them. I spent 6 hours last week on the phone with police brass from all the divisions. And one of the issues that came up is that, for example, in a constructive possession case where you find a gun in a car but not in a hand and not in a pocket, you may need a little bit more evidence to show which person in that car. belongs to that gun. Okay, you may need a little bit more. So we have, for example, seen some cases where both the DA's office and the police department can do better in terms of digging in for that additional level of evidence, whether it's a DNA swab from a defendant to see if it matches DNA on the gun, whether it's some social media postings that would show someone in that car posed with that gun. I could go on and on. But the point is that this is very much in our mind. We're taking it extremely seriously. The whole point of progressive prosecution, of going easy on turnstile jumpers, was to focus on gun violence because it is unacceptable to hold people appropriately accountable. That was the whole point. That's what we've been saying from the beginning. That is what actually worked in Chicago before the pandemic hit and things began to reverse. And in fact, we are experiencing terrible gun violence in 9 out of America's 10 major cities during this pandemic, including ones where gun violence, thankfully, due to some of the programs we're trying to copy here, was going down.
Thank you, District Attorney Larry Krasner. Captain Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, DA Krasner, for your testimony and for your work. I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned in your testimony, specifically about the program wherein you have 2 ADAs per 6 areas, and then you plan to move to 18 all across the city. Can you speak to any early results of this program?
Yes, Council Member, I can, and thank you for the question. Without getting too much into specific cases, because some of these ADAs are actively involved in investigations that are being done of ongoing situations, whether it's groups that frankly have been around, more than a decade and are well known, or whether it's individuals in a particular situation. Obviously, I can't and won't get into the specifics, but I can tell you that we meet regularly. It's about once every 10 days or so with the 12 people who are now deployed out in the community. And what we are finding is that about 90% of the reports we get are very positive from them, that the relationship within the police division is positive, that they're able to be helpful, and they're also learning a lot. So, it is our hope that they're going to bring back to us a lot of intelligence that will be useful to us in making the best bail arguments that we can make. But they will also be of great assistance, for example, in helping to review an affidavit of probable cause for a search warrant, for an arrest warrant, something like that. I think that we may move to a training mode, for example, on the issue I just raised about constructive possession of a weapon and how that gets proved beyond a reasonable doubt. We may be able to work jointly with the commissioner at her invitation, of course, because we respect the police department's independence in that direction. We certainly have had discussions about forensics, and I can tell you that the commissioner, I think, has a lot to say on it. I will not say anything on it because she's taking the lead on that at this time. But I think that we're seeing some positive results. We are also now, in conjunction with GVI, the Gun Violence Intervention Program, we are now going to be doing the custom notifications, and this is part of the reason to move to 3 people per each division. I can tell you this, I feel that it is positive. Nothing's going to change overnight, but we're seeing constructive developments, and I think we are seeing better reports every time we meet, with very few exceptions. We're getting good reports. And in general, in my 6 hours spent on the phone speaking with police brass around the city, in general, we're getting good reports and we're identifying problem areas.
Thank you. And then I had a second question that I just wanted to mention. We all recognize that Philadelphia has a long-standing problem and issue with witness retaliation and with the snitching culture. I've heard my young people say when I was a teacher, snitches get stitches. So what can we do, and what has your office been doing to work with those citizens who come forward with information about gun violence in their communities, and how are we working with those individuals and their families to make sure they are protected? Because I think that's a large part of the issue as well.
Thank you again for that question. That is something, in fairness to my predecessors, this office has always taken seriously. I can tell you, I personally become involved in these situations from time to time when they are emergent, when they are immediate. I won't say who, but we have communicated recently even with a council member who was very, very concerned about the safety of someone who was within her world, and we take it very, very seriously. This office will protect, and I don't just mean prosecute retaliation. I don't just mean prosecute intimidation. We will protect in terms of using all the resources that are available to us. If necessary, we will move people. as much as we are permitted to do so. We have people who work on this full time. And what we want, and I say this as an invitation to every member of council, what we want is to find out as quickly as possible if there is a situation that does not appear to be under control, so that, G. Lamar Stewart and Keziah Cameron, who runs our victim witness unit, and Bill Curtin and some other people in the office can jump on that situation. We know that there are people in custody now, or people out there we're chasing and the police are chasing, who have killed more than one person. We understand that. And it is intolerable to have a situation where justice is obstructed by having the victimization of witnesses and survivors of these incidents. So we are as serious as we can possibly be. And all that we can do is to invite and ask you to let us know if there's a situation we can jump on Sunday night, Monday morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever it takes, we'll do it.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson. Councilwoman Cindy Bass, and then Councilman Isaiah Thomas.
Good morning to everyone. Good morning. And I wanted to first start by thanking the two chairs of the committees, Councilman Kenyatta Johnson, who's been out on the forefront on this issue for a very long time here in the city of Philadelphia, as well as Councilman Curtis Jones. My question is for the district attorney, and it's around marijuana sales. And I know that this is a committee on gun violence, but the gun violence that happens in my district primarily is connected to marijuana sales. And I know that this is not really popular, what I'm going to say, but, the conversation I think that some of the leadership here in the city of Philadelphia has had around legalizing marijuana, the idea that it's pretty much okay now. A lot of people think it's legal now, and the further perpetuation of the conversation around the legalization and how great that's going to be for the city of Philadelphia. Well, I don't feel so great about it right now in Germantown, and it's not legal in Germantown, but a lot of people feel that way, and it's leading to an enormous amount of gun violence through these transactions, through these sales. And so I wanted to hear from our district attorney, if you could comment on this, because I know, like I said, the position that I'm taking is not the popular position right now, but I'm okay with that. But I want to hear from our district attorney, who, as I understand it, recently, did an op-ed or a written piece around the legalization and how that's going to, be much better for the city of Philadelphia in terms of arrests, in terms of violence, and other municipalities who have legalized aren't saying the same things. There was just recently a report on 2020 about the legalization and how they thought that the illegal market would go away and how it would be so much better and they would be spending so much less on crime and incarceration. And the exact opposite has happened. So I'd like to hear more about, how we get in front of that issue, because, for all of the folks who feel like there's nothing wrong with smoking weed, there's nothing wrong with, buying weed and consuming. Well, at the end of almost every homicide that's happening in my district is a transaction related or connected to a marijuana sale. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate on your position on that further. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, council member. I appreciate that. So number one, this office prosecutes and always has prosecuted the illegal sales of marijuana. That is what we do. The only difference between this administration and the prior administration when it comes to marijuana is that we no longer prosecute the small number of marijuana possession cases that were being prosecuted when we got here. 80% of those cases were already being dealt with under what is essentially a ticket, which, of course, the mayor himself pursued. That is the only difference. We prosecute all marijuana dealing. I understand your point. It is true that some of the homicides and some of the gun violence that we're seeing in different parts of the city, including Germantown, that some of it does relate to illegal sales of marijuana. I will say this, though. It does not relate to illegal sales of alcohol. We do not have people being shot on street corners because someone is selling bottles of whiskey anymore. And we used to. It was called Prohibition. What happened during Prohibition is that gangs came to run the illegal liquor trade, and there was blood on the streets as a consequence. The real answer here, I would suggest respectfully, is that the state should get around to what the governor wants to do in the first place, which is allowing for adult use legal marijuana in Pennsylvania. And you will therefore see exactly what we saw after Prohibition, which is that the street corner sales were diminished. There have been some issues in other states where an illegal trade of marijuana persisted, but that was almost always because taxation was out of line. When taxation becomes truly extreme, you can end up with the illegal sale of cigarettes. You can end up with the illegal sale of alcohol. But when taxation is approached in a reasonable fashion, you can do that. And the other thing you can do is what
Mr. Attorney, I don't want to interrupt you, but I do need to say that I don't find a comparison to Prohibition, which was nearly 100 years ago or so, that is relevant to today. So I understand where you're going with that, but I think fast forwarding to 2020 and the homicides that are occurring now, that I don't think that Prohibition is a comparable argument to make. I just wanted to state that for the record.
Well, we will have to respectfully disagree on that, Council Member.
Councilman Curtis, I'm sorry, Councilman Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership. Thank you to both of the chairs for your leadership. I appreciate Councilman Johnson convening us yesterday. I think that it was the beginning of hopefully what will be a productive conversation around solutions as it relates to gun violence in the city of Philadelphia. I'll try to be as efficient as possible with my questions, and thank you, District Attorney, for joining us today and for your testimony. And I'm just, I want to just attack this from a solution perspective. I think it's important that we recognize that this isn't personal. People across the city of Philadelphia are suffering, and similar to what Councilmember Jones's presentation showed us, there are a number of hotspots in the city where we need to identify where those places are and provide as many resources as we can from a council perspective, because that's our job. So first and foremost, just being a Philadelphia guy who has a few relationships, I'm noticing a lot of people, and there's a lot of talk about people being shot in their car. And what young people are talking about is when people are shot in their car is presumed to be some type of setup. I'm wondering if the district attorney's office is knowing any level of increase of people shot and killed in their car, and why that might be happening and where that's coming from.
Council Member, thank you very much for that question. I'm just trying to sort out what I should be talking about and not. I can tell you this, as an anecdotal matter, I cannot refer to data, although I can get it for you. But as an anecdotal matter, we have certainly seen more than one situation where there is a pattern of killing people in cars. I am aware of one situation where it appears that what was going on was pre-planned killings, some of which were for money. I am aware of a situation like that. It is a common modus operandi. It is a common way of planning the killing of another person. I cannot tell you whether the number of killings that occurred in cars is increasing. That is data that I can try to get from our homicide unit, and I think it may also be obtainable from the PPD, so I can further answer your question.
That'd be great. Thank you. I mean, so the other side of that is, again, there's dialogue and there's rumbling about there being a lot of hired shooters in the city of Philadelphia. And when people are having conflicts with one another, there's one thing to kind of know who's coming for you. It's another thing when we have this, what I'm being told is an epidemic almost of people being hired to kill other people, which is leading to the number of increase in people getting shot in their cars, and also putting us in a position where, folks are extremely vulnerable, and also why we might be seeing a lot of innocent victims being shot. So I'm wondering if there's any specific task force or anything that's looking at the number of hired shooters that we're being told, or at least the rumors are that those numbers are increasing.
Council Member, I think that there has been some reporting of a recent arrest by the Philadelphia Police Department and prosecution by this office of a man who was a contract killer and who is in some way or other linked to 4 separate homicides. That aspect of it is public record. I can tell you that, during my 33-year career, there have always been some cases involving some contract killers. And I can also tell you that there's more I know that I am not at liberty to talk about at this time, but we take your concern very, very seriously. And we are working actively with the Philadelphia Police Department to see what can be done about that. I think it is logical, and I can tell you based on my 33 years of experience, I think it is logical that you are, unfortunately, perhaps more likely to have a mistake about the intended victim when you are dealing with contract killers who don't even know the face necessarily of the person they have been sent to kill. So I think your concerns are entirely valid and somewhat heartbreaking. But let me just say this: I am not at liberty to speak about everything that I know, and I'm certainly not at liberty to do anything that might compromise any ongoing investigations. One of the issues that we are actively discussing with the police department, and that I hope to advance, is the importance of wiretaps, which, in my view, are utilized very effectively by federal law enforcement, but have not been used as effectively historically in Philadelphia as they might be, to the extent that we are able to find the resources and get the personnel, both in the DA's office and also in the PPD, who are properly certified to do these things. Wiretaps are an incredibly good way to get inside of criminal organizations, as opposed to just observing what people did and trying to rely on civilian witnesses. So that may be one of the many paths forward in this regard. But again, as much as I regret not being able to say more, let me tell you, this is very much a concern. It is one of our front and center concerns within our homicide division.
Thank you, District Attorney. We'll make sure we
I just want to
about that. Go ahead, sir. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you. I just want to follow with Councilman Thomas' remarks. Yes, it's widely known, at least on the street level, that there are hired killers for as low as $500 to retaliate and take a person out. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with the intended target. A lot of these young guys are going after, if you hang with someone who was involved in a homicide, that you don't have to be the intended target anymore. We will take out your brother, your cousin, or your friends. And so just a little bit of information that as relates to, at least what we hear on the ground, from a violence prevention standpoint, from a crisis intervention standpoint, that's just additional information. Councilman Curtis Jones and Councilman Allen Dow.
Thank you again, colleague. So this question is not just for you, but I'll have it on the record so that those who testify after you can kind of respond to it. So all murders are critical and sad, but all of them aren't the same. And what I mean by that, in order to deal with the crisis, do we say, all right, here's the murders that happened domestically. They were crimes of passion. It is very difficult to predict that and to prevent that. These are the crimes that were drug, as Member Bass talked about, drug-related. You can predict hot spots and where that kind of activity can be and plan differently. If we're talking about issues of Facebook, Twitter gangsters that are going through some type of back and forth beef that you can kind of, through police intelligence, kind of predict are retaliatory. Those are, if you codify them in each of the categories, some are more preventable than others. Some are treated with counseling, Others are treated with a hardcore, hard stop, camera-related surveillance. Are we using our respective organizations, the police, the district attorney, some of our partners at the state and federal level, to kind of codify some of these murders and then creating a little more customized response? I say that because of one gentleman who will remain nameless. Everybody who is in this knows who he is. He chronicled a whole murder group with names and pictures and things like that of how these individuals were operating almost in a organized crime way. That is very different than somebody on a Friday night that got a drink spilled on them and said you disrespected me.
So thank you for the question, council member. I believe, honestly, I think that the police commissioner is going to be able to give you more specifics on some of the really good things that have been happening with the PPD for some time. It is a fact that there's a unit within the PPD, and I'm not going to get more specific because it's for her to talk and me to be quiet, but there is a unit that is looking very closely at social media, and their achievements are considerable in terms of being able to find some of this information out. My office would, we would be grateful for as much information as they're willing to share, because often it may predict something that's going to happen in the same way social media at times was used to predict fights between kids getting out of school. It may be used for that purpose, but it's also often compelling evidence for the purpose of investigation and prosecution. Some of it's not all about, I'm going to do something on Wednesday. Some of it's bragging about something that already occurred, and you're not quite sure what they're bragging about until you start to put the pieces together. So I do think that, number one, it's a tremendous tool for law enforcement in terms of solving cases, and on occasion it may also be a way to prevent a homicide, which of course is our real goal here. It's not cleaning up after the mess, it's stopping the mess. That's what we all want. There's nothing more important to me than having shooters off the streets. And I'm willing to do anything that I can do consistent with the law and the Constitution to make that happen. Your point is an excellent one. There are 5 different levels of homicide. And we take those differences seriously because justice is individual. But the cases we're talking about today are some of the most serious cases. They are some of the most heartbreaking cases. The ones we're talking about today are nearly all first-degree or third-degree cases calling for extremely severe sentences and extremely severe consequences. Some cases call for that. And where the case calls for truly serious consequences, that is what this office is going to pursue.
It was interesting. It was tragic. We see on social media, and I do admit, and I have admitted to the chair, that he is more in tune to Instagram than I will ever be. But you can see groups of guys going into other neighborhoods that they have issue with and posting on their Instagram, here we are looking for you in your neighborhood, where are you? And that kind of taunting goes back and forth until there's a tragedy one way or the other. But
well, number one, it's awful. Number two, I only wish we lived in a world, and maybe we'll get there. Maybe there can be resources to get us there. I only wish we lived in a world where that kind of notification that we are here to get you was instantaneously known to police, because it constitutes a crime in and of itself. And it constitutes an opportunity for immediate arrest and for prosecution and for saving the lives of the other ones, whose blood they're out to spill, and frankly, saving their lives too. Because so much of this, when we talk about protecting the public, it's all the public. And this risk-taking behavior at either end of the gun ends up taking lives. So I would love to see a situation where forensic capacity, technological capacity is even better than it is now. And it is very good with the Philadelphia Police Department. I'd love to see that world, and I'd love to be able to participate in a way that's constructive.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Councilman Diamond Squiller, and that's the last 2 questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, District Attorney Krasner. I just have a few brief questions, and brief answers are great. The first question is, do you believe that this increase in violence is mostly attributed to the pandemic?
I'll be brief, and thank you for the question, Council Member. I believe we're looking at essentially 7 consecutive years of homicides going up and increases in gun violence, and I believe we're looking at 2 decades of the number of guns on the street increasing. But I think it is clear that a significant portion of the increase, and a lot of the increase this year in 9 out of 10 of Americans major cities has been pandemic related, to the point where even in other cities where the violence was going down, it reversed and went back up. So yes, I think it is an important factor.
Okay, so I mean, which probably leads us to the faster and the safe way we can get our economy back on track with a smart restart. That might be a help here. Here's my second question. In the past 2 years, any idea of how many cases you prosecuted as related to shootings and homicides and what the outcomes were?
I can get you that data. I don't have it sitting in front of me, but I can get you that data.
Okay, last question. Not really a question, but maybe just a suggestion or a statement, and maybe you can add to it. Whether it's true or false, perception's reality. And the perception on the street is that the police department is somewhat demoralized. And somewhat demoralized because they feel the district attorney's office doesn't have their back, basically. How do we build that relationship where the district attorney's office, the police department, everyone's working together as a team and pulling in the same direction?
So, to be as candid as I possibly can, when you have a clearance rate of 20% in neighborhoods where there are a lot of shootings, and I say that as an entity that is involved in trying to change that, so it's not to blame. When you have that kind of a clearance rate, I have to think that has a little bit more impact than if you arrest a police officer in a Ninja Turtle outfit who's pulling down masks and spraying faces with OC spray. I think that's a false narrative, and I think it's a political narrative. I don't think it comes from our police department. I think it comes from the head of our police union, who is full on in campaign mode and has been for the 30 months that we've been in office. We can say perception is reality. Call me crazy. I think reality is reality. Perception is a factor, but I think reality is reality. And what we need to do here is look at the long-term causes if we ever really want to get out of it and address them. And we need to look at some of the short-term causes and see how we can work better together. I can tell you that I have enjoyed a very constructive relationship with Commissioner Ross, and I believe I'm enjoying a very constructive relationship with Commissioner Outlaw, and I look forward to continuing to do that.
Okay. I will say this. We have to find the middle where everybody comes together, including the head of the FOP. Whatever it is, we got to find that middle, because otherwise it hurts all of us. And so the less name-calling we have, the more we act as a team, the better we'll be together. Thank you for today. And thank you, Chairman Johnson.
Thank you, Councilman.
Councilman Squilla. Mark Squilla.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Jones. I appreciate this hearing and how important it was, and even the event yesterday. As we heard yesterday, the people in the community are feeling like their voices aren't being heard, and it's up to them to lift their voices up to make sure that these people in these communities who are suffering through this very violent trend that's going on here in Philadelphia and amongst other cities, so that we could help hopefully prevent this in the future. But District Attorney Krasner, I know you mentioned Catherine Gilmore Richardson had said something about safety of victims and witnesses, how important that is. And I know you said about trust, but what I hear on the street mostly is fear. There's a lot of fear when these people are out there shooting on streets. There's people that are locked into their homes and are afraid to go out. When they do see something, they're afraid that they could be the next victim. And I think protection is the most important part. And is it true that most witness protections cannot be in place until there is arrest made from the district attorney's office?
That is not entirely true. We have been involved in many situations beforehand. It does get complicated because some of what we do is subject to state funding and state requirements. But this office will do everything it can, formally, informally, through traditional methods, through non-traditional methods, to protect people early and to work with the police department to do that. I do not want people to walk away from this hearing thinking that we are not here to protect them. We are 100% here to protect them any way that we can with the resources that we have.
I think it's important to have those folks know that, because if there's not arrest at that time and somebody's still out there and they're afraid that those people are out there, so they do not want to give information. It's important. So even if the district attorney can't do that, can we work with other sources and other victim protection programs to get to them to make sure they feel safe? And I know there's some background or some people unmuted out there, but
Right, I did hear you. Yes, we can work with all sorts of entities, and we can further discuss in private if that is useful. We can further discuss how we might work together.
yeah, I think that's very important, and because we need their help, and without the community's help, the police aren't going to be able to do this themselves. The district attorney can't do it themselves. We as council members can't do it. We need to work this together, and I think yesterday was the start of hearing the community's voice and knowing that they want to participate, but we got to make sure that we're able to protect them. And I know you did mention also Chicago, some of the platforms and programs they had before COVID and how they work. I mean, it sounds crazy, but I'm not sure we would follow those programs because of the issues that Chicago's having. And maybe it is some pandemic related, but we could take in pieces of those programs and try to implement them here. But not all those programs are working either. So, I mean, thinking outside the box, also listening to the people that are on the street and using those people formerly incarcerated, some of the people we heard yesterday, to help us get into that street level, to talk to these kids, to give them different opportunities, I think is so important. So, I mean, I'm on board to help in any way we can, but following programs that we see may have worked previously but aren't working now may not be the best option. And I think we need to look at other options and all options if we're really going to really prevent some of the violence that's going on today.
Council member, I certainly agree with that. I mean, one thing that at least in the meetings I've attended hasn't been spoken about too much is, for example, the GRID program in Los Angeles, which has had success over a long period of time in reducing gun violence. It is not a law enforcement-led program, but it's been very, very effective. That may be a little outside of the box. It may be something that we want to take a look at. But I totally share your idea that, even though some of these programs work well and they don't work, they may be failing at the moment in another location. I totally share your point. You have to try many different methods, something that you have to have a layer of many different methods, and hopefully in conjunction there can be real progress.
Hey, District Attorney Krasner, I know you have another commitment. Can you indulge Councilman Derek Green for one last question? He's the only one that had a question, and we can wrap you up on this panel. Thank you. Appreciate it. Councilman Derek Green.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. I was going to see if our district attorney could come back tomorrow, because I know he has another appointment. But I just wanted to go back to what Councilmember Johnson, the chair, special committee, talked about, as well as some of the conversations from Councilmember Dom. District Attorney Krasner, I applaud the efforts you've done in restorative justice and some of the collaborative approaches that you've taken in this office. I say that as a former assistant district attorney and assistant deputy attorney general in Delaware. But my concern, and I heard some of this commentary from my colleagues, and you made a point of reality is reality. And the reality is that we have a gun violence issue in our city and a public health crisis. And so my question is, going forward, what steps will all the entities take to work more collaboratively together without the rhetoric? Without the rhetoric of this person said this or this person said that. If an entity is not willing to work with you, that's understandable. But what steps are going forward? And I hold myself accountable as a member of council, as an elected official. But what steps going forward are you going to take, and also are we going to take to address this issue? And I would like to see those actions without the rhetoric against other entities.
So I thank you for that comment. I totally share it. It's before we were talking about a pandemic, before we were imagining this kind of a spike in gun violence, we were just looking forward to a summer when it might be hot and there might be more violence. I was in discussion with some of the other folks who are of concern here about how we needed to have a united front. The city, the DA's office, the police department needed to have a united front in our efforts. I
hate to jump in, but also we don't have the resources just to solve this with just the police department and this attorney's office. I'm also talking about our attorney general, I'm also talking about U.S. Attorney. I'm talking our first judicial district. They can't publicly be engaged on things, but they can be engaged behind the scenes. I'm talking about Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I know there are different political dynamics and perspectives, but we are in a crisis, and the casting blame and aspersion on others, let them do that. I just hope that going forward that you're going to bring people together both in a private way and a public way about addressing these issues.
I understand what you're saying. The bottom line is that we've enjoyed a very good relationship with the career professionals in the U.S. Attorney's Office. We are enjoying at this time a very good relationship with the Attorney General's Office in our Gun Violence Task Force, which has existed for 13 years. All of those entities, including ATF, including FBI, including Probation Department, et cetera, are included in the shooting calls that have been organized by the PPD, which we believe are a very, very positive step. It wasn't that long ago. Our office sent 35 gun cases down to the U.S. Attorney's Office and said, please take these. We work with both the AG and the U.S. Attorney's Office on investigations, federal law enforcement, more significantly on investigations very intensively. We have some that have been going on for a very long time, and we value those relationships. I think the media is much more excited about reporting statements that are sensational or that are politically motivated, that sort of thing. I have no need to be in the middle of some of those criticisms. In fact, frequently we make a point of not. But there are also moments when it is institutionally necessary not to be a doormat.
Sorry, District Attorney, I hate to jump in, but when you said there are moments, I think that's part of this issue. When you say there are moments to talk about institutional issues, and I understand all of that, being an African-American man who has a son who is lived in this city of Philadelphia. But the moment that we have is a gun public health crisis. Those institutional moments will have to be at a different time. I'm asking you to put aside some of those perspectives, and I understand your office has good relationships with career prosecutors, career agents in these various agencies, but I'm asking you in leadership of those organizations, the Bill McSwains and the Josh Shapiros and others, and let's put aside the language and the rhetoric, and let's work together.
You and I feel the same way about that. I certainly hope that will happen, and I have no desire to elevate unnecessary political attacks to the level of the Daily News and the Inquirer. So I'm on the same page with you about that, Councilman.
Well, it's not the Daily News and Inquirer. Sometimes we have to take the high road to address this issue, and I'm calling myself in that same perspective. But I hope going forward, I would see that coming from your office. If those are choosing not to, I just hope that you take the high road, and then we can call out those who are not doing the same thing that you are doing going forward.
You and I are on the same page. I agree with you, Council Member, and thank you for your comments.
Thank you very much, District Attorney Larry Krasner, and also for the record, Councilman Derek Green. I did reach out to the Attorney General's office. Josh Shapiro participate in this hearing because we are in a gun crisis here in the city of Philadelphia, and they officially declined to participate. So thank you, District Attorney Larry Krasner, for being here and participating. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that information, Councilman Johnson. That's duly noted, and we will reach out.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Can we call on Commissioner Daniel Outlaw, the next panel, please?
Thank you. Good morning. Kevin, while I wait for Kevin to get our slide deck up, I have submitted written testimony, but I am going to refer to our slide deck for a high-level overview. Good morning, Council Members Johnson and Jones, co-chairs of the Special Committee on Gun Violence Prevention. My name is Danielle Outlaw, and I'm the Philadelphia Police Commissioner. And I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to allow us to share what PPD is doing as it relates to our efforts to combat gun violence here in the city. With me today is First Deputy Mel Singleton. He's over all of field operations, which incorporates patrol operations and investigations. Also with me is Deputy Commissioner Joe Dales over patrol operations, Deputy Commissioner Ben Nash, who's over investigations, First Deputy Commissioner Coulter, who is over organizational services, Assistant Director Tondela Balsana, who is with the Office of Forensic Science, or for a lot of folks refer to our crime lab. Staff Inspector Fran Healy is also with us. He serves as one of my policy advisors, and also on the call with us is Chief Strategy Officer Ms. Blake Norton. Next slide, please. I've shared this slide before, and I'll say, unfortunately, each time I report out on this, the percentages appear to go up. We do know that since 2014, our homicide and our shooting victims have continued to increase. This year, however, our homicide and shooting victims are up 31% and 36%, respectively. Since 2017, we've seen that our overall Part 1 crimes have been increasing, following a 30-year downward trend since 1989. I like to share this stat because I'd like to point out that we have been dealing with this since 2017. Next slide, please. I share this not to, I think it's important to benchmark. I don't share this to be dismissive against what we're experiencing here, but we are working our way up, and that's not something that we should be proud of. Currently, the city of Philadelphia now ranks number 2 in total homicides across the country, behind Chicago, with 247 total homicides as of July 26. We all know that we are not the only ones, the only major cities that are experiencing this, but overall Philadelphia ranks number 11 in year-to-date changes, percentages and changes in our homicides. We also know that as of 2018, our poverty rate ranks number 3, with about a quarter of our population living below the poverty line. Next slide, please. I've often been asked, what's been the impact of COVID-19 on gun violence? There's been quite a few things. When you look at the 60 days before the pandemic officially hit and the 60 days after, we've seen that our shootings have increased by 31%. But our gun arrests still continue to be consistent. They've also increased 12%. Back in 2019, our shooting victims increased at the last year, but our gun increased 17%. So what this tells us is that even though our investigation averaging about 77 guns per week compared to 80 guns per week in the previous year. So again, the gun violence appears to be a continuation of a multi-year trend. It's not indirectly driven by the pandemic. However, the pandemic has impeded our ability to fully implement all aspects of our action plan. And that's because we know that the majority of our job relies heavily upon social interaction. Social interaction is necessary for all aspects, including community engagement and inclusion, our community meetings, our youth activities. But what we're also hearing a lot is we need to continue to connect with our young people. And the COVID-19 pandemic really has had a serious impact on that. Next slide. Actually, can we go back to that first slide before we go back to what's driving gun violence? I want to touch a little bit more on the COVID-19 piece. There was a question asked, well, do you have less officers out there on the street? We don't necessarily have less officers, but we've had to redeploy a lot of our officers based on making sure that we're safe and we are ensuring the community is safe by lessening the potential for our impact. As an example, we know that COVID-19 heavily impacted our narcotics operations. Because of the pandemic, we know that our narcotics enforcement was limited and really confined, and our efforts were significantly curtailed. And we believe that led to a sense of impunity regarding the operators of the narcotics markets and an increase in the gun violence in the areas notorious for narcotic sales. We had to reassign plainclothes narcotics officers to uniform duties. And we also saw in between all of this that for a short period of time, we had to redeploy our officers to address civil unrest. However, we've recently been able to reassign our plainclothes officers back into their narcotics enforcement details, and the result has been pretty impressive. From towards the end of July to early August, our narcotics units has seized illegal drugs valued at close to $450,000. Recovered over $100,000 in cash, seized 17 firearms, and made 240 arrests from just one initiative. So you can see that there's an obvious impact diverting the officers from the COVID-19 crisis. But when we're able to put resources in the places that we need them to be and to keep them there, it certainly has an impact. Next slide. A lot of this question has been answered by a lot of things already said on here. What's driving gun violence? We talked about some of the social determinants already, but one I think is really important to point out is the case law of Commonwealth versus Hicks. Some folks may know this, but there's case law limiting our ability to stop persons observed carrying firearms. And in this case, the court held that the mere possession of a firearm, even if a concealed firearm, does not provide reasonable suspicion to perform an investigative detention. So while a lot of folks may say, look, we know that person has a gun, go talk to him, go stop him, go search him. See, it's right there. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have automatic reasonable suspicion to stop them and to ask further questions. But that doesn't mean that we are going to stop our efforts in getting illegal guns off the street. I also shared again in the previous slide that we are averaging about 77 guns a week. So it's not just PD, are you getting guns off the street? It's yes, we are going to continue our efforts in those areas, but we also need to look at collectively what's being done to stop the flow of legal guns falling into the hands of those who are using them illegally. Bail reductions for violent crime and quit offenders. I mean, I think we can beat this one into the ground. And I've said this before, I'm not talking out of both sides of my neck. This is not, solutions are not an either or, it's an and. Some people do need services. Some people do need jobs. Some people also need stiff consequences to be deterred from going out here and repeatedly committing these types of crimes. And some folks are just dangerous people. We are seeing challenges around bail reductions for violent crime and quit offenders, something that we are in constant communication with the DA's office and others about as well. And I talked about how for quite some time, protests and First Amendment activities strain the resources available for addressing crime. Again, we are seeing, in addition to what has previously been mentioned in this call or in this meeting, we're seeing existing rivals between gangs and groups. We're seeing continued competition for control of narcotics distribution. We are seeing existing beefs between individuals. And we say persons with poor conflict resolution skills because we're seeing folks involved in social media beefs because of they felt disrespected in person or, because of lyrics of a song or whatever it is. And instead of going out and handling and mediating these conflicts in different ways, the first thing that they're going to is the gun. In addition to that, there's an increased likelihood that we're seeing for folks to carry firearms in the street, meaning that there's a higher likelihood for folks to use them. Next slide, please. I gave you the background where we are. What are we going to do about it? What's the police department going to do about it? We released this plan back in June. Actually, it was ready a little bit before that, or actually some time before that, and we found ourselves dealing with protests and civil unrest, and it got delayed. But this plan was released in June, and it's a holistic and collaborative approach to addressing violent crime. And initially, I think people were expecting solely the tactical piece. We're going to have cops on dots here, and we're going to continue during these hours to make sure that we are deploying when the highest calls for service are occurring and in those areas using data, so on and so forth. That's only a part of it. I think we all recognize that I was hired to not only address crime, but other issues internally as well. And so in order to, and this kind of reminds me of the conversation that we were having earlier, or I was hearing about relationship building and garnering trust. We talk about communities, but there's also an internal community as well. And it's those officers who are out here being challenged by being asked to do this work and making sure that they have the proper resources and they're prepared holistically. So this violence reduction plan is a collaborative but a comprehensive approach that focuses on not only the crime prevention piece, but community engagement and inclusion, the internal piece of organizational excellence, making sure that we're doing everything that we can to perform at our peak, focusing on time, resources, people, equipment, training, employee health and well-being, and then also social justice reforms. All the things that are needed to make sure that we're seen as legitimate in the eyes of the community, both internally and externally, so we can execute this plan. Next slide, please. There are a lot of implications as it relates to being successful in implementing the plan. The plan itself is about 37 pages. So again, I'm not going into the weeds of that. But the budget is one of the key implications. In addition to COVID, the budget had an impact on what we were able to do. We had to, as a result of the $33 million cut, we had to cut back on a lot of our crime beats that were utilized on an overtime basis to supplement coverage. Those are no longer available. And in addition to that, that $33 million equates to about 200 officers that we won't see hitting the street because of the two classes that were cut, given that our academy has been reduced because of these budget cuts. What that means is, we're hearing a lot of calls for, and I agree, it's actually needed. We not only need visibility. It's one thing to say we need a cop on every block, and being out there the other night, after being out there the night of the shooting, but being out there the other night on North Simpson and, having a lot of the same conversations that Councilman Jones had, the residents out there made it very clear that when you were here, police department, everything was amazing. We were able to live in peace. But when you left, everything returned and went back to normal. So now the question on the table is, it's not whether or not what we know works, is do we have the ability and the resources to sustain our efforts? So that's critical. Being able to recruit, as we're seeing a lot of people retire and attrit, we're going to have to keep the numbers continuously flowing. A lot of folks are calling for diversity amongst our recruits, but also within our police department to enhance the trust between the police department and the community. In order to do that, we have to have bodies. We have to be able to recruit officers in here. We've also made adjustments because of the FY21 impact. We've had to make adjustments. We've put administrative personnel, we've redeployed them into hotspot areas. For example, our neighborhood services unit, which normally removes abandoned cars from streets, has sent to patrol districts experiencing high levels of gun violence. Now, does that mean they can't still work on abandoned car abatement? Sure they can. But it doesn't mean that we now have someone solely assigned to address those low-level quality of life issues that we know can contribute to larger issues later on down the road. Again, our tactical squads are enhancing police coverage on Sundays and Mondays. So when we are redeploying resources from other areas, when we give them the benefit of focusing on very specific missions and details within specific areas, and we move them elsewhere, we do that at the risk of losing any traction that we may have gained over time. With all of that said, our performance goals remain unchanged. This has been done. The new operating model that incorporates weekly interagency shooting reviews that was referenced by the DA, CompStat, and quarterly district strategies by the end of 2020. We've been doing weekly shooting reviews for the last few months now. What makes this important? It goes back to Councilman Jones's question about the level of collaboration, sharing of information, and no longer working in silos. And this just isn't at the local level between the DA's office and the police department. This is at the state and the local, state, and federal levels. It's also making sure that we're sharing this information with our partners, SEPTA, Housing Authority, our universities, because there's a lot of overlap between the areas of their jurisdiction, schools, the areas of their jurisdictions and ours, and making sure that they also have the same information so we're communicating in real time and having clear actionable deliverables when we leave these meetings is critical. And also ensuring that there's real-time communication with federal prosecutors. U.S. attorneys are also on the call to say, look, we are recommending that this case goes federal. Again, I keep talking about consequences, but there needs to be a federal prosecution here in this one. And then they review the cases to determine if it meets the criteria. Having the ADAs on ground is helpful, because what we were hearing when I first got here was, well, there's not a lot of communication in that we didn't know, or the DA's office didn't know. You're asking for enhanced bail, but we didn't have all the history behind this person. By having somebody with us on ground, no one can say they didn't know because they have a seat at the table. So I'm hoping, it might be too early to tell how effective it is, but I'm hoping that this reignited communication will help us in accomplishing our common goal. Our pinpoint areas back in 2008, where we had well over 40. Right now, I think we have one per district. We got to go back to what we know worked, but we also, although this is a performance goal, and I want to make sure that we expand our pinpoint areas to having 40 or more by the end of the year, we also have to be realistic and determine whether or not that's something that's feasible with the resources that we have, including analysts. Right now, there's been a hiring freeze. Of course, we can request a waiver, and we're working on that. But we're short about 28 analysts to be able to assist us with that expansion. Of course, we want to reduce our homicides in our pinpoint areas by a quarter by the end of 2021. And I keep saying pinpoint because we know that these are the parts of the city that's responsible for driving the largest percentages of crime citywide. And we also want to reduce shooting victims in our pinpoint areas by a quarter by the end of 2021. We want to get our homicide clearance rate back to 60% by the end of 2021. When I first got here, pre-pandemic, we were doing amazingly well. I think we were at about 62%. The pandemic hit, caseload increased, and we're hovering at around 50% now. But here's what's most concerning. It's all concerning, but here's what's most concerning. Right now, our non-fatal shooting victim clearance rate is exceptionally low. So it might appear that our target percentage is low at 30%, but I think if we get there and show that we are focusing on not just homicides, but all shootings in the way that we are with these shooting reviews, we'll see some success citywide also. And then lastly, we want to increase the referrals of high-risk individuals to the Office of Violence Prevention by 50% by the end of 2021. And that's where GVI comes in. We know when we're reviewing these shootings, going back to a previous question, we know who are repeat offenders. We know we believe we know, based on what we have in most cases, who's most at risk of becoming a victim or a victim of retaliatory shooting. And then personally, after we respond to a lot of these shootings, I've seen it, we've seen it. Many community members come up to me and come up to my personnel and say, look, this is the third time this person has been shot at. He's not going to make it through the summer if something isn't done. These are the narratives that we then relay to our partners in the Office of Violence Prevention to see what we can do to get these folks off the street before something else happens. Next slide, please. An example of what's been done thus far. This is an example here, the Southwest Task Force. We're getting beat up pretty badly there. We put together a task force that's comprised of one detective, one narcotics officer, and officers from the 4 districts within the Southwest, and also personnel from the ATF and the FBI. Again, I can't stress enough how important it is. You know, some folks walked away and all they heard was collaboration when this plan was announced. But collaboration is key because we have to be able to work with our partners, our federal partners, who might also bring us resources that we don't necessarily have, in addition to being able to prosecute at the federal level. It's important to bring folks like the ATF, the FBI, the DEA in, because we also know that a lot of these cases aren't solely driven in Philadelphia. A lot of these cross state lines. They're a lot larger than one simple case in Philadelphia. And once you cross state lines and we're starting to, peel back some of the layers of this onion, we see that it's a lot larger and much more complex than just one individual or one group in Philadelphia. So if we can get the entire organization for those that are organized, our federal partners are the ones to help us get that. And again, we're focusing on the very small percentage of individuals and groups responsible for the largest portion of the violence that we're seeing here. Referenced before, Operation Pinpoint is our operational strategy under the city's roadmap plan. It's data-driven, it's offender-focused, and it's intelligent-led. Again, it's to make sure that we're not casting a wide net and we're spearfishing. Our current violent crime, our narcotics initiatives, as I referenced, we've been able to reassign our narcotics officers back after placing them in uniform during the pandemic and civil unrest, but they have resumed their investigations and have been actually quite successful in recent weeks. And I just mentioned the amount of cash that we were able to get off the street just in that short period of time from the end of July to early August. Next slide. Quarterly crime plans here are very important. When I got here, there was a lot of emphasis around what's your plan for the summer? What's your plan for the summer? You have to have a plan for the summer, obviously, because historically crime has gone up then. But the problem is that if you only focus on the summer, we're not sustaining any efforts. So quarterly crime plans are now required from everyone throughout. This is year-round. And not only are they submitting a quarterly crime plan, but there are weekly actionable items that are pushed out to their rank and file so they know what their marching orders are. It's not enough for our captains and above to be very well versed in strategy, but the line level officer that's out there responding to calls in patrol doesn't know, or those in specialized units don't know. Internal communication and clear direction and guidelines, very key with this. And they all align with the roadmap and our pinpoint frameworks. I talked about our shooting reviews. Again, this is operational. They're very long meetings, but this is a level of communication that had to be had. And we're seeing a lot of success in these areas in that there's a lot of communication had. The sheriff's office is on the call. If there's someone in custody or should be in custody, or if we need jail call screen, or if we need someone with an ankle monitor placed on them, or if we need to do an overlay of someone that has an ankle monitor and we need to see if that person was in the area of a recent shooting, all of those resources are on the call at the same time in real time. Next slide, please. With that, again, I'll thank you for your time. My team and I are here to answer any questions that you may have for us.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I appreciate your presentation. I appreciate you for coming out and participating yesterday in the Stop the Violence rally. And most importantly, I thank you for being on the ground in the communities. Importantly, talking to victims and co-victims, predominantly mothers who have lost their loved ones to gun violence. I thank you for showing up in my community the other evening around 11, 12, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning on Napa Street where there was a shooting. So I just want to thank you for being on the ground and addressing this issue. And so I want to start off by asking Councilmember Penny Lardier to begin her line of questioning. Next up is Councilwoman Helen Kim.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I want to thank all of the folks joining us to testify today and thank Councilmember Johnson for organizing today's hearing. Gun violence is impacting our city and our country like we haven't seen in decades. In my district, it's a daily occurrence at this point. Just yesterday afternoon, a 29-year-old man was shot and killed in broad daylight in Kingsessing. On Saturday, we had a mass shooting in East Parkside. 6 people, including a pregnant woman, were shot at a cookout. Thank God they're all expected to make a full recovery. Last week, 2 kids under the age of 10 got shot in West Philly and one of them died. This isn't normal. This is traumatic, and it has instilled fear in far too many residents in the 3rd District. When a child isn't even safe playing on his family's front porch, we have more than one epidemic on our hands. This situation is more than an emergency, it's a catastrophe. And I hope that all of you here testifying today appreciate that my constituents and I want to see the city treat this issue with the urgency it deserves. Equity is top of mind for me in my work every day. And I know it's important to Mayor Kinney and to all of you as well. But Black and brown people in our city can't have equity when we are dodging bullets where we live. I want to be a partner in this work with all of you. I truly do. But I'm tired. I'm tired of the deaths. I'm tired of this being the reason that West Philly is in the news. And frankly, I'm tired of hearing the same thoughts and prayers, and this needs to stop after every shooting. And so I came to this hearing today to learn what you all are going to do about it. I'd like to see us do more than say gun violence is a priority for us. In the era of COVID-19, we have to find new and innovative ways to address this crisis, make tangible investments in their success, and prioritize the voices of those at greatest risk. And so with that in mind, my first question is for you, Commissioner. Precise and timely intelligence is vital to the success of gun violence interventions like GVI. In your testimony, you talked about conducting weekly shooting review calls with state, local, and federal partners over the past few months, and that it might be too early to tell how effective the reviews are. But could you talk about the metrics that you will use to evaluate the effectiveness of these shooting reviews and how many referrals these reviews have generated for GVI?
Sure. So before I turn it over to First Deputy Commissioner Singleton, who facilitates our shooting reviews, I will tell you this, anecdotally, and I don't like to give anecdotal responses, anecdotally, I will tell you that having everyone in the room, unless you've worked in this world for quite some time, it's very difficult to get everyone at the table at the same time, one. But two, we kind of heard a little bit of it earlier. Another potential challenge, unfortunately, we don't see as much of it, but another potential challenge is this. I have my vision for the department. I set my performance goals for what we would like to do. Just because I set my priorities does not mean that those are the priorities of my counterparts, right? So I have to communicate those priorities and pretty much hope that they're also aligned and share the same priorities. I would say that it's when I say it's been successful in that sense, it's because they still keep coming. They keep showing up to the meetings. They're very lengthy. They're open to hearing feedback and somewhat criticism if we provide it. When we question why something wasn't there when we think maybe it should have been, or if someone got out of jail when we think that they shouldn't have been, that dialogue is happening and it was not happening before. And we're seeing immediate follow-up on a lot of the deliverables that come out of these meetings. When we're asking PHA for a specific ask, we follow up that following week and say, okay, what happened with that? So we have the ability to do that, and it's ongoing dialogue and conversation and follow-up. But Commissioner Singleton, do you want to chime in on that, please?
Yeah, I'll try as best I can to answer that question. So we talk about shootings, but shootings are the apex of crime, the most horrendous apex of crime, right? But there's a road to that, right? There are crimes that lead up to that actually the MO of shootings. For instance, stolen vehicles. We know that a number of our shootings were committed by vehicles that were stolen, right? We also know that people who would shoot also use drug sales to fund themselves, right? To sustain themselves. So our possession with intent to deliver is another crime that's in line and in the direction of shootings. We also know, obviously, carrying guns is the equipment that's used to commit these crimes, right? And so the shooting review meetings, we utilize that to address these, what we call nonviolent offenses, to actually try to mitigate and stop and interfere with what we know are going to eventually result in violence, right? And so when the commissioner talks about collaboration, these things were not discussed before, right? as a whole. Holistically, they were not discussed. But now we know that if a person is caught selling narcotics, for instance, that we've had up to gentlemen with up to 6 possession with intent to deliver, which are felonies, 6 open cases walking around on the streets of Philadelphia. Right now that we're information sharing with the DA's office, with our partners, we understand that we have to take possession with intent to deliver more seriously. So we're requesting through info sharing, we're requesting enhanced bail when it's time for prosecution, that they take these cases a little more seriously than they would have as a one-off situation, because we know that we have gentlemen that have history that we need to actually, the chances of us catching them actually in an act of shooting, that takes time, right? And we typically don't catch them in an act of shooting, but we will catch them in a stolen car. We will catch them with selling drugs. We will catch them with a gun. Also, too, our guns, right? We know now that we have to, even though the commissioner itemized Commonwealth versus Hicks, which is an impediment to us stopping these young men, but she also identified that we're still, even with that impediment, getting a number of guns. What has to happen is a total education between all of our partners that these things have to be taken seriously, because if we can stop, if we can totally mitigate these less nonviolent offenses, we can have a heavy impact on the violent offenses. So one of the things that's happening during the shooting review meetings with all our partners is that we're reviewing painstakingly, reviewing every shooting with our partners. Sometimes it's a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Sometimes it's a joint mission between our alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, our BNI, our other state and local partners. Sometimes it's merely making sure that we know that Mel Singleton, for instance, is someone that has been shot multiple times. He's uncooperating with us, and he's on probation. And so we reach out to our probation officer folks to make sure that they understand that he either needs to cooperate with us or face the possibility of having his probation violated. Those types of things. So we're getting high bail. We're attacking from these lower hanging fruit to get to the apex of what is the violence. And so what the commissioner is talking about, and what's very important and what was not in Philadelphia, is having all these partners at the table to try to address these folks on the smallest of levels to try to mitigate and stop the most violent things that is going to eventually come to. So the matrix that we're using and we're going to be using is obviously the improvement of the collaboration between all of us, which we're getting there, right? To the commissioner point, we're constantly at the table. They have not stopped coming to the table. They have not gotten bored with us, thank goodness. Also, too, making sure that we are mitigating, taking off, how are we targeting these folks that we know are eventual shooters or most likely to be shot, right? And we're doing that. We're identifying folks. In fact, we have identified most of the folks that are recommended to our group violence intervention program is coming out of the shooting review meetings. So that's happening. But then also, too, eventually, we hope and it should have an impact on the violent crime. We have our folks identified. We know who our players are, for lack of a better term, and we are targeting them in every way that we can. The group violence and intervention program allows us to do things like message groups, right? Also offer alternatives to the lifestyle that they're currently living. So I think that the shooting review meetings are tremendous in doing this. Now, we haven't been doing it long enough to see an impact. We have to do more. We have to keep plugging away at this program, and it actually has, and we have actually, everything that I suggested, we've actually done, and had young men, everything from young men who have been arrested for guns, got out on the street, made bail, right? We found that they got back involved through social media, and we had the bail revoked, right? We had the bail revoked. So we are doing all those things, and I think after a while, those things will have an impact.
Respectfully, over 1,000 people have been shot this year, right? So that's a crisis. And in a crisis situation, in my mind, we need to have a clear strategy, and we need to have a clear way of measuring our strategy. If the shooting reviews, if we're saying that's a piece of our strategy, then we need to have metrics beyond we're generating dialogue amongst departments. I understand that it hasn't been in effect for a long time, but I would expect for us to be able to say this is how we're going to be able to tell that this method is effective. Also, my question around how many referrals to GVI have been made by the shooting reviews, that wasn't answered.
So I don't have an exact number for you, but I can get that number for you in terms of the exact number. There's two pipelines into the GVI program. One, there was a group audit conducted by John Jay University. So that was a pipeline. And then the shooting reviews are a pipeline into the GVI program. And so I can get that number for you, but I don't have it in front of me.
And I'll also say this really quickly, without dragging this time out. There's a very clear strategy laid out in those 37 pages. I didn't want to bore everyone with the time, but I will not be dismissive of or diminish the fact that we have, again, there's strategies here. There's quarterly crime strategies. We use data. We identify the areas. And I know you might seem like you've heard this before, but this has been ongoing for a very long time now. And we know that it works when we keep our foot on the gas. The problem is that when we let our foot up off the gas, for example, like on North Simpson and in other areas, because we are either chasing the radio or don't have the resources to maintain that, I think that's the real question. That's the real question. What do you do? What happens when we don't have the resources to stay where we've been or to expand? So I think the sense of urgency is there. We share your sense of urgency. And our performance goals are what they are. Those are the metrics.
As a follow-up, I'd love to know about the specific ways we will measure the effectiveness of the shooting reviews. I think we have to be clear with the public about how we're measuring the effectiveness of our strategy. Keeping with the theme of intelligence, your crime prevention and violence reduction strategy recommends surgical policing through intel and data analysis and calls for responding to crime and violence with intelligence-led policing to accomplish the police department's mission without alienating the communities you serve. This recommendation calls for external evaluations of key police department initiatives like GVI and requires filling 33 open civilian intelligence analyst positions. How quickly can you fill these positions? And if the positions cannot be filled due to a city hiring freeze, how will you implement this initiative?
So GVI is not our initiative, so I won't be able to speak to that. That's through the Office of Violence Prevention. But as I referenced earlier, those 28 additional vacancies for analysts, we're working with HR now to see if we can get a waiver to continue to hire those bodies.
Thank you. When do you expect to have more information?
I don't know. I'll circle back with HR today. Again, it's something that's all in the works. And I'll circle back. Or Commissioner Coulter, are you on the call? You're still there? You can answer that. Either way, we'll circle back.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Commissioner, I am on the call. We are working with HR, and we've had discussions to make sure that we're getting their critical civilian positions. They'll bring a lot to the table, and it's really the only way, not to speak to the roadmap, but to speak to pinpoint. It is the best route to be able to expand our pinpoint into multiple districts and multiple sites within districts. So they are critical. We certainly make it a priority, and I believe that as we push it through, we'll have success in being able to get those folks on board.
Thank you so much.
Councilwoman Helen Gim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say good morning to everybody and to the broader public. I want to thank the chairman for working very quickly to address the issue of gun violence. I think all of us are here and deeply committed, in part because of what is happening right now to Philadelphia's children. 102 young people shot tragedies like Zamar Jones horrifying us on a regular basis. I want to thank Commissioner Outlaw, Deputy Commissioner Singleton, and so many others within the police department for your care and love for these young children right now. And I think as Chair for Children and Youth, more of my questions are going to focus in on what we are doing to actually think about expanding our resources in this area. I know you have a partnership table that should include the School District of Philadelphia. One of the struggles of this moment that we're having right now is that we're trying to make connections with families. We're especially trying to increase our links and supports with young people, some of whom are returning from placement or from detention themselves. And, there's a lot of concern about making sure that they're supported in a world in which for the last, since March, we've been on a virtual learning kind of trajectory. We haven't been able to make those connections quite as well. So I'm curious about what the police department is doing right now to work with the School District of Philadelphia to support young people, especially some of our system-involved youth, and what kind of conversations you're having with them.
Thank you for that question. I'm going to turn that over to Commissioner Dales. And I would add to that, especially given that we're in a pandemic, how are we interacting with our young folks, given that school is out, what that looks like, what we've done during the summer to partner with those who are responsible for programming. So Commissioner Dales, do you mind chiming in on that?
Yes, good morning. So some of the things that we are doing, we are working with the school district, former Deputy Commissioner Kevin Bethel. We are working hand in hand with him. We are still focusing on our diversion program with the youth, where they also coordinate with DHS and District Attorney's Office and other resources to help put these kids back on the right track. We also still have our PAL, Police Athletic League, in effect as well. So far, we have 18 centers total, but due to the pandemic, we have 11 centers open. And each one of these centers, we have about 20 kids who are enrolled in those centers at this point. That's still up and running. We are going to continue to run our Dare and Great program, which will be held virtually due to the fact that we have virtual learning during the school year moving forward. But these are some of the things that we are doing with the youth. We also focusing on putting together a youth PDAC board in place in each division. So far, we're going to put one in each region, Rock South and Rock North, starting with probably the 17th or the 2nd district. So we're working on that as well. We need to have the voices heard from the youth in the community, because that the kids, they know a lot. They experience a lot. And we need to know, what do they need? How can we help them? What do we need to do on our end to engage with the youth? Because that is one of our weakest areas as far as the youth. And we all know during this hearing here that a lot of youth don't trust the police. And we're trying to bridge that gap. So these are some of the things that we are doing, and we're going to continue to focus on moving forward. And that is part of the commissioner's plan as far as creating a youth commission, a youth commission / PDAC. So these are some of the things we're doing.
Thank you very much. And I didn't mean for you to run through a list of all the programs that the police department does with youth. I know you do a number of different programs with youth. I think part of my conversation right now is to ask whether we're talking about new forms of relationships and partnering. We're also talking about expanding into areas where we have struggled. Right now, has there been, I go back and forth with Kevin Bethel. I think he is an enormous asset to the School District of Philadelphia. I think he's an enormous asset to the city, and I'm sure he's a great partner with the police department. I am curious, though, that the Philadelphia School Police Division, which is being restructured and repurposed, is a $31 million entity within the School District of Philadelphia. They have over 380 school police officers who are currently virtual right now. And while I would be very careful about how to talk about use of resources and all of that, I am curious about whether there are ongoing conversations with an agency, with an institution like the school district that has a different type of relationship with its young people than the Philadelphia Police Department may be perceived as having. And I would hope that, with 384 school police officers who should be trained, and I know Kevin Bethel will be on later, but I did want to also encourage the police department. They are trained in de-escalate. They should be trained in de-escalation, restorative justice practices, mentoring. When we talk about violence interrupters, there are 384 school police who are not currently online right now, who could be partners with the police department. And I'm curious about whether that conversation, and I will be bringing this up with Kevin Bethel. We're going back and forth a little bit because, again, we want to respect the fact that they are not the Philadelphia Police Department. I do not expect them to work for you. I do not expect them to become full-fledged members. I do not want them to carry a gun. I don't want them to do investigations. But they are unique partners because they have intense relationships with young people in schools. So if a young person is involved or if a neighborhood situation is involved, I hope that you could see those 384 individuals as potentially being an asset to expand your reach, especially in relationships with young people.
Yes, and we as a matter of fact, we are in communication with Kevin Bethel, and we have talked about bringing back the monthly meetings with the school police to talk about issues inside school as well as outside schools, because we all know an incident occurs on the street, they'll bring it into the schools. If an incident occurs in the schools, they'll bring it out to the streets. So these are some of the things that we're going to continue to do moving forward. We'll be talking about meeting monthly with commanders from their respective districts to talk about the issues and what we can do to resolve those issues and quell those conflicts.
Understood. Thank you. And Commissioner, I know that Kevin Bethel has been a really big advocate because he has worked with you about taking a look at, say, transit stations and other places that are technically beyond the zone of the direct school property. So if that is the case, and school is not in session through Thanksgiving, and I hope that there can continue to be, and I will be having these conversations with Kevin Bethel and with Vanessa Garrett Harley as well, that part of this is a collaboration. Not everybody can be online. The school district is a partner on this effort. We're trying to save the lives of children. The percent of school staffing who are not directly in the teaching mode do not have to be online right now, but are key partners with us in saving young people's lives and mentoring them should, I hope, be seen for you as a partnership effort and not deployment, but kind of like just a rethinking and an expansion of our imaginative possibilities. We don't have to rely on the school police all the time. We do have to expand our reach with young people. So I hope that, this can be an ongoing conversation, and I'm happy to be a partner with you on any of that kind of thinking as well.
Absolutely. Sounds good.
My second question and my last one is about one of the things that ended up on your PowerPoint slide, which is that, obviously we want all of our resources devoted out into our neighborhoods. This is a key role for us. And I know you identified one of the challenges to that as being First Amendment demonstrations and protests that are going on right now. The police department has had a really strong division that has traditionally dealt with First Amendment protests, and that is civil affairs. And my hope is that here, as we approach middle of August, we are not seeing demonstrations as requiring a full-fledged police response that pulls people away from neighborhoods. I think civil affairs has long been able to handle this. I think demonstrations in the last 2 months in particular, and 3 months in particular, have shown that they are an exercise of First Amendment rights. They are not a danger or a menace to the public. And I think that when those things do happen, they are unusual and we should redeploy and all of that. But I just want to make sure that when you cite that a challenge that you're facing, and I wasn't sure if you meant that was like in the spring or whether you think that's a current challenge right now, is First Amendment demonstrations. I want to make sure that we are actually not having that be a challenge. We should not be pulling police officers from neighborhoods and communities to deal with First Amendment. We've got civil affairs for that. So I wanted to see if you could just clarify that.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. I would say when we experience, whenever we experience large numbers, you're absolutely right. Civil affairs is amazing when it works with that. And in recent weeks, even though we've seen the frequency of demonstrations remain constant, the numbers and the increased frequency of numbers are down, but we're seeing peaceful protests. The frequency is about the same. So we haven't had to deploy a lot of officers or redeploy them from neighborhoods recently, which is why I use that as an example in talking about how narcotics officers were able to go back at the end of July to a lot of their details and their enforcement efforts, which they are put together to do. So yes, to clarify, when we do get intelligence, for example, there was one particular Saturday, I don't remember how many weeks ago, there was a national call for protests and demonstration throughout the country. But there was also some information sent to us that there were a small handful of folks that were intent on being violent. And in situations like that, we do have to make sure that we are better safe than sorry, and we pre-plan and we have numbers to deal with something that may occur. We can always scale back later. But I will say over the recent weeks, absolutely, we have not had to be able to we have not had to deploy the number of officers that we had to at the beginning of June and end of March and throughout June.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just had a quick question before I bring up the next council member who has a question. Commissioner Outlaw, part of your presentation seemed to imply that if there would be more resources, you could do more. And even with the decrease in the 33 million, you were able to still focus on the target of addressing your needs around gun violence and the various other areas regarding crime and violence in general. How much savings have the Philadelphia Police Department saved as it relates to normally during this pandemic? We have a lot of officers in my district and at the stadiums patrolling these games, right? Flyers, Sixers, Eagles, Phillies, and I know they're making significant overtime. Well, I'm assuming they're making significant overtime patrolling down there. Then we also have officers when we have different shows taking place throughout the city of Philadelphia, and all those have been shut down. Do we have a dollar amount, a figure of how much savings have been saved as a result of those shows not taking place and officers not being deployed and patrolling those events?
I don't know if we have a dollar amount for you today. I will turn it over to Commissioner Coulter, but I will tell you initially when budget talks were happening, we were comfortable in saying that we identified our own cuts and that we didn't have to work these events and, the things that usually happen during the summer, the concerts, the festivals. But then we also saw the tragedy around Mr. Floyd, around George Floyd. And then we found that even though there was a pandemic, there were several rallies that we had to assign folks to. And so it doesn't necessarily mean just, I don't want to say it balances out because I don't have the number specifically. I'll ask Christine, but we thought that we would be able to go into the entire summer without having to deal with any of that. But in fact, we did. So, Commissioner Coulter, do you have a number today?
I don't have a number of the savings, but what I could get you is the cost of the events that happened last year and give the comparison that they're missing. One of the areas that we have saved significantly, not that it works necessarily in our favor, is that our officers have not been in court. And that's also an overtime driver. So we've been able to save normally what we spend in court each month, not spending. Some of the sports complexes, although there is some savings, some of that is covered by the professional teams. They cover a majority of the officers there. We cover whatever we need to supplement that. But the special events that we haven't had, like the 4th of July and upcoming Made in America, we're very new in the fiscal year, just started July 1. So we haven't experienced many of those reoccurring events yet. But as we get to them, provided there's no other crisis, we will start taking the money that those events normally cost both the police and the city.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to say, and obviously we're looking for solutions, we're looking for recommendations. The eyes of the city are looking at these hearings to make sure we're not just having hearings for the sake of hearings. And so, Commissioner Daniel Outlaw, I thank you for your presentation. Most importantly, I'm excited about the gun violence review meetings that you're having. I want to follow up what Councilwoman Jamie Gardier talked about, looking at the metrics and the benchmarks as we move forward. I do remember under another administration, I remember participating in the crime stat meetings. And those crime stat meetings were very, very helpful because it had every law enforcement agency at the table, meeting in the district attorney's office on a weekly basis, all rowing in the same direction with the same level of aggression and the same level of passion. And so for me, I would expect the same moving forward because at the end of the day, these are children who are dying in the streets of Philadelphia. These are women being shot and murdered in the streets of Philadelphia. We have African-American men dying on a daily basis. And so when you talk about collaboration, I would believe that all of us as council members in the city of Philadelphia expect all law enforcement agencies to be approaching this as such, as if it's their children. And me, and just like the rest of my councilmen, we still live inside the neighborhoods. I'm going to put it that way. We still live in the inner city of Philadelphia. And so bullets have no names. And so we go to and from the corner store, or if I'm taking my children to daycare and we walk, right, we're still subjected to the same level of violence as a regular person who is an elected official. And so thank you for your dedication and your commitment. This won't be our last hearing. This won't be our last meeting. 1 second, Chairman Jones. And one last thing that you talked about that I'm excited about, we saw this at the rally yesterday, is connecting with our young people. If we can continue to find ways like your initiative of creating a youth commission / youth PDAC to encourage more young people to work in partnership with the Philadelphia Police Department, inspire them to become officers, inspire them to get involved in things that are positive, that is great. And also we continue to take in consideration how to partner more with community groups as we move forward who just want to help you provide information and also be that boots on the ground, because I'm one of those people that also recognize it's not going to take just the Philadelphia Police Department to save us. We're not going to wrest our way out of this situation. We know a lot of these issues come from the issue of poverty. So on our side as elected officials, we have to do a greater job in tackling poverty here in the city of Philadelphia on a long run. But I will be upfront when I say this last statement, but my constituents want to feel safe now. They say, yeah, Councilman, we hear you. We know you want to address poverty, but what are you going to do now about my grandmother when she goes to and from the store, or that mother that I have to console because she calls me because she lost a loved one, or I just got DM on Instagram because the mother just said, listen, I lost my daughter in my arms in July of 2020, right? I want to be a part of this movement. I want to express myself. I need some support, and I want to be on the front line. And so it's all of us who has to roll up our sleeve and get involved to address this issue, because people want to feel safe like right now, immediately. Councilman Curtis Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did not mean to interrupt. It just sounded like you were saying goodbye. And I wanted to just make sure one of these questions were answered. So if we were using a process evaluation review technique, which is basically from the point of arrest to the point of release or point of prosecution, where is the breakdown with guns? And wait a minute. Let me clarify what I mean. You arrest, if I saw your chart and read it correctly, you are making gun arrests. And how many of those arrests are multiple arrests for guns? So this is not the first time you saw this person. And what is the reason you're seeing them again so quickly? Is it a breakdown in the courts? Is it a breakdown in the bail commissioners? Is it a breakdown in prosecution? And in the spirit of Councilman Green, I don't mean to toss people under the bus or for you to be combative, but doggone it, we got to get to evaluating where some of this is breaking down. Because if you're arresting these people and we're seeing them again, and they've got prior history, we need to do something different. And like I said, and I agree with Chairman Member Johnson, that, listen, I want to look at the systemic reasons for crime, but I want the bleeding to stop now. So can you elaborate on the process?
Yeah, actually, I would be happy to. So a couple of things to address Councilman Johnson's comment about CompStat. We still have CompStat, and I would be more than happy to figure out a way. You know, shooting reviews are law enforcement only, but I would love to invite some of you to CompStat so you can see how we are not only holding folks accountable internally, but how we review the data and the intelligence that we do have, how it's used, how it's operationalized, and how that in real time, again, within that sense of urgency, is pushed out, and how we hold folks' feet to the fire, so to speak. With that said, Councilman Jones, that's a very good question. Back in May, and I know the DA made some reference to it at the beginning of his testimony. Back in May, I formally requested the DA to assign a full-time analyst to his shop so we can do quality assurance of very specific cases. I would love to say that I made up the idea myself. I didn't. It's something that Baltimore is doing in addition to their crime plan. There's an MOU between the DA's office or the state attorney's office and the police department. And it's because while I assigned someone, when I first got here, I assigned someone internally to track our cases. We can only track our cases up until we present it and hand it off to the DA. Anything that happens after that, once it's charged, how it matriculates, whether or not something is downgraded, the bills, all of that is very difficult for us to access that information and get real-time information so we can then incorporate that into what we're doing right now today. That information is had by the district attorney's office. There's been a lot of communication. It sounds like he's willing to information share, for lack of a better way of saying it, but I think what we really need is a full-time person that is reviewing this. So we can then say, hey, and the DAs on ground help a little bit with that, but we need to know what happens after the fact. So we can make sure moving forward, the next time we get a similar case, we don't repeat the same missteps if there were missteps, either on the investigative end or on the prosecutorial side. All sides have to be willing to see that, hey, we need to improve here. So I think it's a very fair question. The ask was made, like I said, of me back in May, and I don't want to put words into the DA's mouth, but that's what needs to happen. But it sounds like he's open to doing something similar.
So, Mr. Chairman, if we, as a committee, could take a deeper dive into this, the surface issue is that we are experiencing deaths, and they are being committed by shooters. How those shooters wind up getting an opportunity. I heard how lesser crimes might be feeder crimes into the shooting crimes. We need to take a deeper dive and look and analyze that data to make good information. If this is not the first time that shooters rodeo, then why is there a second time in close proximity to the first? So we need to help to track, analyze, dissect that process. So if there were 100 shootings over the last half year, how many of them were second time, third time gun violations? And what was the process that allowed them to be second, third time gun violations and then shoot? And for us to look at that and see where in the system is that breaking down? And maybe in so knowing, we can get to the heart of the matter. Yes, systemic poverty. I want to deal with all of that. I'm in 100%. But what I am not, I'm sick of teddy bear memorials. And we have to walk and chew gum. We have to walk and stop the shooting. We have to pray thoughts and prayers, but then we got to do the work. So I am asking you, Mr. Chairman, along with the members of this committee, to then take a deeper dive and let's narrow this down and say, in our law enforcement process, from the point of arrest for a gun to the point of release to the point of rearrest, what happened?
Absolutely. Councilman Jones. Now follow up, and I've been asking that question myself several nights over this last few months, and I'll touch base with you as it relates to the follow up. But yeah, I believe that has to be addressed as it relates to, and to be quite frank, I think it's a combination of when a person is arrested, when a person is prosecuted, if that person gets off on a technicality or not. Because again, I said this early on, in the streets, the word is, you get locked up with a gun, 9 times out of 10, you're going to make bail and get out. That's just the reality of it. It's not no shot. I'm just talking about what I hear on the street. So the technicality part, the legal part, if they get Shaka Johnson as a lawyer and he's able to get them off as a technicality, or they have some type of legal defense fund, a legal defense to get them off, all of that needs to be examined to make sure that those who are committing these crimes with these guns are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. So rather that's on the prosecution side or the arrest side, it needs to be addressed. So most certainly, that's something that will come out of this committee as a follow-up, so we can take a deeper dive and look into it as a whole. And also, if you are a member of the committee that's participating and you have a question, please use the chat, the chat to let me know, to be identified that you have a question. Councilwoman Kendra Brooks?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yes, this is Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Yes.
I indicated in the chat that I had questions after Councilmember Jones.
I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Go ahead, Madam Catherine Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to circle back to the testimony and data provided by our commissioner, and just thank you, Commissioner Outlaw, for your testimony, but specifically around the data points. If you could just hyper-focus on the data specifically during the period of COVID, and we know that in this pandemic, a lot of the issues that we've been dealing with have been further exacerbated. But could you tell me whether or not drug-related shootings versus all other shootings, what's the correlation there? What's the percentages? Because what we're hearing on the streets is that there's a lot of money flowing on the streets, that people have a lot more dollars to, purchase narcotics and other drugs. So it's really a lot of territorial fights that are happening around drug territory. So if you could help us pinpoint that information with the data, even if you don't have it today, if you could provide that to the chair, that would be most helpful. And then the other piece that I wanted to focus on was a more longer term solution around the homicide clearance rate and the correlation there as it relates to witness cooperation or lack thereof. What are your plans to further diversify the detective unit in the police department so that we can have additional diversity amongst those detectives who are actually investigating the shootings and the murders that are occurring?
Thank you for both of those questions. We will get back to you through the chair as it relates to specific percentages, as it relates to drug-related shootings. If you recall, we made some amendments regarding the types of arrests that we would make at the onset of the pandemic, because we saw that a lot of our shootings were drug-related, over territory, and it wasn't just, at the time, because we initially thought that the funding or the money wasn't out there. We've also seen an introduction, and there's only so much I can say on this part, we've seen an introduction of counterfeit currency as well. That's driven a lot of these shootings. So we'll get back to you again through the chair regarding the percentages, but you're absolutely right in that area. As far as the homicide piece goes, and I would even say, again, non-fatal shootings, there's a lot of work that needs to be done structurally as it relates to our clearance rates. I'm going to turn it over to Ben Nash, who has been charged. We've had some really good and meaningful community meetings and input as it relates to not just the topic that you brought up, ma'am, around diversifying our detectives, but also ensuring that community has a voice and that there is regular follow-up on cases, even if there's nothing to report, but to ensure that families are connected. And also understanding that folks need to know that these cases are being solved and there are consequences in order to feel the trust to come forward to solve some of these crimes. Commissioner Nash?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Good morning, council person. The commissioner speaks about building the trust with the community, and as you talk about increasing the level of diversity in our homicide unit, that's a part of what we want to do. We also are working to have a greater level of trust with the families of all of our victims, whether it's with the homicide victims' families or even in the non-fatal shooting victim families. There is a high level of distrust, and I'm going to maybe point to an elephant in the room, and I'll point to some of the criticism has been the drop of our clearance rate. And the clearance rate for homicides can't be overstressed of how important it is to bring closure, hold people accountable. So often we talk about if somebody gets away with a homicide, they're probably likely to go out and commit additional homicides. And one of the council persons talked about somebody who had been and asked DA Krasner about someone who had been arrested for multiple homicides, going back to somebody in the community who had put a lot of pressure to bring about that clearance. And in fact, that person was arrested for 4 homicides. And that is a person who clearly, because he was able to get past the first one, was going on and killing other members of our community. And that's extremely challenging for all of us. But I do want to say that as we've seen the increase and this terrible toll that is being taken on our community with this rising number of homicides, it's had a negative impact on our clearance rates. And at the beginning, and I'm going to go back to not just the pandemic created some challenges for us, but even throughout the pandemic, we were doing, I think, as an organization really well in clearing and bringing in homicide arrests and bringing closure to the families. But then came, and as we've all referenced, there was a massive amount of change when the protest started as a result of the horrible acts that took place in Minneapolis. And when the George Floyd protests began and we first started to feel a local impact on May the 30th, at that time, we had a clearance rate that was almost 57%. And our homicide number, our increase was 15% above where we had been and comparable to the previous year. And now we're at 30% above where we were from the last year. So our homicide increase has exacerbated throughout the protest period. There's a lot of factors, and the commissioner has addressed a number of, all the council people have addressed a number of the factors. Somebody had just mentioned about the drug trade having an impact on homicides, and there's no doubt, yes, the drug money and the fights over territory has been has taken a terrible toll on the community and on raising the homicide numbers. So what we've been seeing is the impact of COVID combined with the impact of the protests and some of the challenges that we've faced in diverting our resources initially. But I think that you just start to see maybe an erosion of trust in the community with police, and we have challenges in trying to get community and members of the public to assist us. I mean, I will say this, some of the greatest, everybody asks, how can you slow down the homicides? How can you slow down the shootings? How can you increase the clearances? Our biggest tool, because we so often don't get cooperation from first of all, on a non-fatal shooting, we often don't get cooperation from the shooting victim. And that's the first challenge in clearing a non-fatal shooting. But in a homicide, we don't have the victim to help us. We do get some cooperation from community members. Family is incredibly important in helping us because as everybody knows, they hear about what's going on with their family member. But then the biggest piece of the puzzle becomes the video. And we've referenced the terrible events of August the 1st with Zamir Jones and the 7-year-old that was shot on Simpson Street. Well, because we were fortunate, we had a quick response by police. The individual that was responsible for setting a and in return, as that person is leaving in their pickup truck, the person who was shot at is going to fire his gun down the street and take the life of a 7-year-old who was just playing on his steps, on his porch. We solved that case 3 people have been arrested. We're happy. We're fortunate that justice is going to be served. But I mention that to talk about how important and how the challenges that we have in bringing these cases in. We do face challenges with cooperation. And again, we all talk about the clearance rates, homicide at 49, almost 50%. It's not high enough, but it's within the realm of a national average. We're trying to get higher. We were getting close to our goal, and then we got sidetracked. We got pushed back. But the non-fatal shooting clearances, a lot of people are talking about that. The commissioner has referenced it. It's so well below where it needs to be and where we absolutely want it to be. And everybody wants to know why, how come they're not being solved? And let me just put this out there right now. A non-fatal shooting means that there's a surviving victim of a shooting. And there might be witnesses to that shooting. We might be able to get video that's going to help us. And I can tell you on the shooting on Sunday night where 3 people were shot, including an 11-year-old, a young man was shot right in front of his family's house. And as far as we can tell right now, there is no reason to figure out why he was targeted other than he might have put out a social media post that he was out there, and maybe somebody had something, decided they wanted to target him. But I can tell you that this morning, because of video, we identified a suspect, and we've taken somebody in, and we hopefully will be able to clear that and then try to figure out what happened. But let me go back. When people are surviving a shooting, they are the first critical witness to that shooting. And as the commissioner and as our first deputy commissioner alluded to, when we have not just no cooperation, but we actually get roadblocks from those people, the ability for us to, as we call it, clear that case is overwhelming. The challenges are overwhelming. And so if there's one thing from an investigative perspective I would ask, it's that we invest in more and more videos, especially within the homes. The video that came from Simpson Street was from the corner grocery store and multiple cameras that were security cameras that showed the entire act from the part of the individual being on the street, having gone to the grocery store. We had them all identified. And then it shows the pickup truck going down. So I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm getting exactly to what you want to know about what we can do with homicides. The frustration that we all feel is overwhelming. We do need to have a closer bond with our community. We are working as hard as we can to maintain, to reestablish that bond. It's a challenge time. We can't forget that right now there is a fair amount, let's face it, there's actually a lot of animosity against the police. And the whole idea of people protesting to take away funding from the police, the results of it, what's it going to do? It's going to take away from the goals that Commissioner Outlaw has outlined. All the things talking about making our organization better. Well, if you take away our funding, it's going to be hard to carry those things out. So what we want to do in homicide, yes, we want to increase the number of investigators in homicide so they have a lower caseload. That would be wonderful, and that's something that we ought to be doing. We want to increase the level of diversity so that there can be a greater connection. But these are the challenges that the budget cuts are placing on us. And then again, the community challenge. We do need cooperation. And the district attorney alluded, there was a question about witness protection and can it happen before somebody is arrested? Well, I think that's generally speaking about in homicides. When you talk about witnesses, when it comes to a non-fatal shooting, how are the witnesses going to be getting involved if they know that the person who is responsible, who is the victim of that shooting, doesn't want that shooting to be cleared? Sometimes that person was involved in activities that brought about, and we are faced with so many obstacles on our non-fatal shootings. But again, video is great. It really helps out. Three young people shot since August the 1st. 7-year-old Mr. Jones, Zamir Jones on Simpson Street, Napa Street on Sunday night. Both of those incidents are going to be closed and brought in as a result of the help from the video. And I just think that if we can if we can get across to the community, if we can do something to everybody who wants to know what are the police doing, I think we have to turn back into ourselves and ask the question, what is the community doing when it comes to having the violent incidents occur? How many people are stepping forward? I understand there was also a question about the people who are going through a revolving door with our VUF arrests, our gun violations. It's true that there are a lot of the people have multiple gun violations, and they seem to just keep on going through. We've got it, but there are limitations on what we can do when it comes. I'm sorry.
For Mr. Nash, and for the sake of time, and Mr. Chairman, I want to respect the time of the hearing because I know we have a 12:30 stop time. But I do want to follow up on some of the things that you stated because I do think it's important that we, continue to have a conversation around how we look at reallocating resources to ensure that we are addressing the needs of the community and the individuals that we serve, particularly in this moment. So I will follow up relative to some of the hiring issues that I think we need to address in looking at how we can offer an opportunity for young people, specifically in the city of Philadelphia, to have an opportunity for civil service employment in hopes to help diversify some of the efforts that we see, particularly around employment in the police department. But quickly, I had a very last question on if you could respond to, since COVID-19 and since everyone has been home, if you have any data around school-age children who have been involved in any incidents, particularly as it relates to conflict. And I know Councilman Johnson and Councilmember Jones and myself, we all have been talking about mandating a conflict resolution within the school district of Philadelphia. And I think it should be from K all the way up to 12th grade because our young people simply don't know how to resolve conflicts without grabbing a gun. And then with the proliferation of social media and everything going online, it just further amplifies the issues that we are seeing. So if you have any data that you can present to the chair for the sake of time that shows and indicates the amount of incidents that have occurred with school-age children being in conflict since the onset of COVID, that would be so helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Council Member Kendra Brooks and then Council Member Isaiah Thomas.
Yes, thank you so much, Council Member. My question is in reference to how does wellness checks play into violence reduction? And also, what is the turnaround for someone that reports the need for a wellness check with a family member or reports a potential for an incident on social media? What is the turnaround in the response for that in reference to prevention? That's one question.
Thank you for your question, ma'am. Are you talking about check the well-being calls that are called into 911 and the police respond?
Yeah, because I've heard several types of wellness checks. Folks have called our office and asked about either doing a wellness check related to domestic violence. And then on the flip side, I heard landlords say that they want a wellness check to get into a facility, an apartment or whatever. But one in particular, it resulted in a homicide. And when the police were called, they kind of overlooked the issue that was happening inside the house.
We'll have to circle back with you on an answer for that one.
Excuse me?
We'll have to circle back with you on an answer for that one.
Yeah, so I would like to know what's the response time, because I think that that's a way to, we talk about wanting the community members' involvement and making sure people are reporting incidents. But if people are reporting and calling in incidents and aren't feeling they're getting a resolution, especially when it ends up in death, that's not creating a sense of community with police. And my other question is related to you said so many resources are needed in order to move this forward and get the work done, so to say. But I have a question. When we talk about earlier, the DA, about gun charges being thrown out for not being valid or just being dismissed in cases, is that a result of officers that are on the do not call list or are they actively involved in any of these cases? Because I know they get moved to different units. By any chance, do these units overlap with these cases around unsolved gun violence or uses of guns?
I think that's a good question. And that's why I asked for this analyst to go back and tell us so we can do the quality assurance. If there are cases that are thrown out because if there's lack of investigative sufficiency, or if there's an officer that is deemed not credible and can't testify in court, or if they're being downgraded later on down the line, that's the data that we don't have and that we're all seeking to get.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Outlaw, how soon do you think that information could be available? That's a critical part of, I think, what's on all of our minds, and we can kind of separate fact from fiction and fact from what we hear on the streets regarding gun crimes and who gets away with gun crimes and what's actually being done about it. And so is there a time frame we can put on providing us this information from the analysts?
Well, I would love to. Again, I can't speak for the DA's office. We are working with, I've been recently told that we are working with the DA's office, meaning our folks at the divot, to get information around gun crimes, RUFAs, and PWIs, but that further information is still needed from the district attorney's office as far as what happens once we turn the case over or cases are dropped and so on and so forth. So someone from the DA's have to answer that.
Thank you. Any other questions from members of the committee? Thank you very much. Commissioner, will the clerk please call up the next panel? Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Theron Pride and Shondell Ravel.
Shondell, you want to start us off? Just state your name for the record and your title and begin your testimony, please.
Good morning, Special Committee, Council members. Shondell Ravel, Executive Director, Office of Violence Prevention.
And good morning, Chair Johnson, Chair Jones, and members of the Special Committee on Gun Violence Prevention. My name is Theron Pride. I'm the Senior Director of the Violence Prevention Strategies and Programs for the City of Philadelphia's Office of Violence Prevention. In this role, I have the privilege of serving as the head of the office and leading a dedicated team of men and women committed to our mission of implementing strategies and initiatives to prevent, reduce, and end violence, particularly gun violence in our city. And as you've heard already, I'm joined today by my colleague, Shondell Ravel. Of course, what's happening now is not normal, and many people have spoken to that already, no matter how often it takes place. We know gun violence is preventable, but we know we can only prevent it with the help of all of us assembled here today, working together. So we appreciate this opportunity to update you all on the expansion of our gun violence prevention and reduction efforts, which support the city's comprehensive strategic action plan entitled the Philadelphia Roadmap to Safer Communities. And we'd like to thank the chairs and the members of the committee for your continued support and partnership in this work. Without question, all of us are fed up and incredibly frustrated with the rise in shootings and homicides in our city, as already been expressed. Even more so because this senseless violence continues to claim the lives of so many precious children. And there are so many young victims out there, and there is yet a small group of individuals killing our kids that show no remorse or willingness to put down their guns after they have torn families and neighborhoods apart. And sadly, even as we battle the COVID-19 pandemic and reckon with the ugly generations-old reality of racism in our society following the murder of George Floyd, this unprecedented and trying time is made even more difficult as we confront this epidemic of gun violence and experience this disturbing trend in shootings and homicides. Of course, we are not the only city to see a staggering rise in gun violence, as the commissioner outlined. We can see the same violence is happening in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and many other cities. But our responsibility lies here at home. So we all share in this pain. We all share in the outrage. And most importantly, for those of us in public service, we all share in the unmistakable urgency to solve this crisis in Philadelphia. That said, instead of letting this pain go without purpose and the anger without action, all of this only reinvigorates our will and reaffirms our resolve at the Office of Violence Prevention and across the administration to further scale up programs and add additional strategies to the roadmap that are proven to reduce violence and make communities safer. This is why we, along with our city partners, launched the Group Violence Intervention, or GVI for short. This month, GVI is an evidence-based strategy that elevates the role community support and social services play in reducing gun violence. And most importantly, it involves law enforcement, which includes the Philadelphia Police Department, the District Attorney's Office, partnering with community to focus on the small, active number of people driving the violence plaguing many of our neighborhoods. This is a key point. The research and data shows much of the shooting violence is driven by a very small percentage of the population, individuals who are part of violent street groups. To be clear, this is not a heavy-handed law enforcement approach to the problem. We know we cannot arrest or prosecute our way out of this, as it's already been stated. This is about the community and law enforcement delivering a unified message to stop the violence to those who are engaged in it and offering services and support to those who want the help. Much like the efforts of healthcare workers to stop the spread of COVID-19, GBI is about stopping the spread of shootings in Philadelphia. If we can stop one group-involved shooting, we have the potential of stopping countless others that typically follow when opposing group members choose to retaliate. The strategy is simple. Community partners with law enforcement and social service providers to help keep people safe. The services and supports offered to participants are completely voluntary. Participants are not forced to take advantage of them. They are simply given a choice. However, the message is clear. The shootings must stop. Full stop. There will be swift, certain, and legitimate consequences for those individuals and groups who do not heed the message and continue to engage in gun violence. However, the consequences will be fair and will rely on the least amount of enforcement necessary to hold groups accountable, not just individuals. In addition, we have expanded our Community Crisis Intervention Program, also known as CCIP, which uses a credible messenger model to stop the violence. These messengers are credible because of the lived experience they have growing up in some of the most violent neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and many of them have their own powerful stories of how they successfully turned their lives around despite the trouble or hurt they may have caused or experienced at one point in their lives. As outreach workers for CCIP, these credible messengers help us engage communities experiencing high rates of gun violence in order to mediate and reduce tensions that often lead to shootings. They also act as an important liaison between community and government by helping residents at risk of violence access and connect to needed services and supports. As you know, our funding supports the Philadelphia Anti-Drug, Anti-Violence Network, also known as PAN, to operate CCIP. And we are pleased to announce that PAN now has the 51 crisis workers, also known as advocates, as the need for CCIP grows. That's 51. That's closer to the goal that the council has stressed for us to reach in terms of 64. And as you may recall, CCIP was launched in July 2018 with only 9 crisis workers. But thanks to the support from council, we have scaled up and now have more workers to cover more hours of the week to intervene before this violence occurs. We also continue to invest in and collaborate with our community partners. In January of this year, we announced $1 million in funding for the second round of targeted community investment grants to help with increasing services and supports in neighborhoods most vulnerable to gun violence. This brings our total investment to nearly $2 million awarded to dozens of grassroots organizations that offer safe spaces, career skill building, sports leagues, recreation, wellness, and community revitalization projects, just to name a few. Of course, most of that work had to be suspended due to the stay-at-home order issued by the administration to slow the spread of COVID-19. However, most of our grantees are now in the process of safely resuming their projects or working to restart them now that the city has entered the modified green phase of reopening. Thanks again to the support from council, we also have funding available to award another round of grants this fiscal year. Moreover, with the assistance of the crime data and analysis provided by the Philadelphia Police Department's Operation Pinpoint, we continue to use data to drive our efforts to implement the strategies in the roadmap to ensure we focus on the people and places most at risk of violence and assess whether our interventions are effective. Prior to COVID-19, we could see that our collective efforts were making a difference in the areas identified under Operation Pinpoint. At one point, it was clear that while violence was up citywide, violence in the pinpoint areas was going down. Our bringing city agencies and departments together weekly to focus on these areas in order to determine how best to use all available resources to respond to challenges in these hotspots was having the desired effect. Our approach was working. Now, as we move through this unprecedented time for our city, we must not abandon what we know can work to prevent and reduce gun violence, but we must adjust and adapt to the current circumstances that confront us. We still have a long road ahead of us as we work to stop the spread of COVID-19. We still have a long fight ahead of us as we work to eliminate the racial inequities and disparities in our institutions that perpetuate the problem of gun violence. This does not mean that we stop partnering with the community to stop this violence or shy away from engaging the individuals most at risk of it. Our approach to prevent gun violence can still work, but we must adjust to ensure we avoid spreading COVID-19, and simultaneously, as has already been stated, we must do the hard work of rebuilding the trust in our communities impacted by gun violence that have experienced the effects of systemic racism for far too long. These urgent challenges are not insurmountable. While our hearts are filled with grief over the loss of so many citizens to gun violence, we will use this moment to redouble our efforts, strengthen our partnerships, and renew our faith in what is possible when we all come together. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My team and I, as well as others from the administration who are helping us to implement this roadmap, are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Darren. And I know we have a hard stop at 12:30, and then we'll be until tomorrow. But however, I have some intelligent colleagues that are straight to the point. So I'm going to be real quick. I'm very familiar with rollout of GBI, and we're waiting to see what the results are going to be. I'm very familiar with the crisis interventions. Not crisis interventions, the team, PAN team that's doing the work. My question is just real quick. We knew there were budget cuts that have taken place. And one of the key areas that was cut was the Office of Violence Prevention. And I know on one end, the Philadelphia Police Department, so many words to mean a difference, but we want to prevent crime from happening. And so for some reason, the administration made the decision to cut from the Office of Violence Prevention. And I know AVRP was replaced with GVI, but why not do both, right? Because we're in a state of emergency. We have shootings happening on a regular basis. And so it shouldn't have to be this or that as opposed to both from an investment standpoint. So give us an overview of the impact of those cuts. And are we thinking outside the box in terms of, okay, we have a $700+ billion budget deficit as relates to COVID-19. Are we reaching out to other public-private partnerships such as the Chamber of Commerce, such as Pew Charitable Trust? Like, because I know Pew Charitable Trust has stepped up for rebuild. They have stepped up for bike lanes. They have stepped up on a variety of different other areas. But we talk about black and brown children dying in the streets of Philadelphia. So are we looking at innovative ways of supplementing the resources that we don't have as a government and leveraging those resources that we have to help address this issue?
Councilmember Jones, thank you, Chair, for those questions. Councilman Johnson, sorry, thank you for those questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to give you our perspective on the budget. Certainly, it has an impact, and Councilmember Johnson, as you mentioned, the Youth Violence Reduction Partnership was something that was cut as a result. Shondell, I know, can speak to more of how we're trying to necessarily adjust and adapt, because we recognize that, again, we still have to worry about those individuals who are on probation, who are most likely to kill or be killed. So we still have funding available to support efforts through adult and juvenile probation to provide intensive services and support. But we know that, again, with the group violence intervention, we are going to take a more laser-like focus of those who are really at the top of that list in terms of really driving that violence. And so we're hopeful that through the group violence intervention and what we're still doing with probation will allow us to cover the gap. As you know, we have to just adjust to what budget we have in front of us. As everyone has said, with more resources, we always are hoping we could do more. But with the resources that we have, we are absolutely committed to being laser focused on the individuals who are at the highest risk of this. And I don't invite Shondell if you want to say a little bit more about what we're doing with probation.
I do. Thank you, Councilman Johnson, for that question. And talking about the loss of YVRP, I look at it more as we're incorporating what GVI is doing with keeping a critical piece of YVRP. We're keeping adult and juvenile probation. We're calling a new project the Violence Reduction Partnership. We got 600+ individuals on YVRP, right? So we're looking at how can we incorporate the most intense services. So by keeping juvenile and adult probation, monitoring these individuals, and we also looked at what pieces of PAN we could incorporate and still keep. So what we did was we invested in the social service department, and I can talk about that later as we talk about CCIP. Currently, we have 8 individual staff who are just dedicated to social services. So they incorporate what they're doing with adult and juvenile probation, still making referrals for jobs, for services, for any type of services that they need, not only for them, but for their family as well. So we're starting to look at what pieces we can get the best bang for our buck. We know we can't keep the entire project, but by keeping the services monitoring them as far as juvenile adult probation, and then having some type of social service piece, I think we could still have a project that works.
So I'm going to do this because in 5 minutes we're going to have to recess until tomorrow. I'm going to ask for Councilman Curtis Jones to wrap us up before I call for the motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If, Sam, you could put up that Simpson Street chart again. I understand that you have a number of acronyms and programs that are designed to address the carrot and stick approach. They call them different things. But when you look at Simpson Street and where that young man died, tell me why there was not a mathematical formula developed to identify the 200 block of Simpson Street when you had as many murders, as many shootings, as many actors, as many armed robbers as a place that pinpoint would work. How are we making these decisions about where that goes in light of the fact that Member Gaudier, that in light of the fact that Representative McClinton and Representative Cephas and former Representative Movita Johnson fought to get money and resources for that. If you are looking at a data-driven model, then Simpson Street being at the center of that, 3 homicides, 11 shooting victims, 23 robberies with firearms, 33 aggravated assaults with firearms, and 15 shooting incidents wouldn't make that an operation ground zero for your program.
Well, Councilmember Jones, thank you for that question. And again, when we talk about Operation Pinpoint, the police help us zero in on the grids that on what the data says in relation to the homicides and shootings are the most problematic. So I wouldn't answer for police in terms of how that is all structured. But I will say that for the areas that we are focusing on with Pinpoint, and as the commissioner said, they are expanding out those grids. It's clear that focus on the
No. Let me say this. I do this for a living. I'm an elected official politician. I can spin with the best of them. We're going to focus on this question. How could this map, with this data that is common, how could you pass over this area?
Again, I would say that you might want to ask that question to police in terms of how they're setting the pinpoint grids, but I would say that this is not something that we want to pass over. So with Simpson Street, what you've outlined are clearly issues and concerns that we would want our community crisis intervention program to be looking at and involved in. So we have now more workers to cover more ground. And with the group violence intervention, that is something that was just launched this month. So GBI has just come online.
All right.
Here
So let me say this. We fought for I remember during the budget process, Councilman Johnson called me up and said, we get ready to go to the Met for gun violence resources. I remember that, and that is in the face of other priorities we may have had. So we're now 2 years into this, right? But the shootings are going up, the murders are going up. I'm saying to you, COVID may be a reason, but the shootings didn't take a break during that crisis. You can't take a break during this crisis. If you look at this map singles out one block, but what it shows is a lot of that violence that's outer ring violence comes from that block. Now, if a lay person like me, who has not been in law enforcement, knows that Simpson Street block is hot, all of the Dick Tracy's down there better know it too.
Well, I can speak to, again, the Community Crisis Intervention Program, and this is something that Shondell, I know when we talk with Pan, we're always trying to think about deployment for those individuals, and now that we've been able to grow those teams, again, that is always the question of where's the place that we need to put them where they can.
So if you ask Member Thomas in his priority areas where the block is hot, he'll tell you. If you ask Council Member Johnson or Gaudier or Bass or Sanchez or Parker, we all know. And it doesn't take a algorithm half the time to figure that out. I pulled this up. It was common information. And then if you ask a kid on the street, they can tell you what block is hot. So if we need to get to 40 pinpoints, let's get there. We don't need to, analysis paralysis. Our children are dying.
What I can add is this, real quick. I'm sorry, Councilman. Yeah, and I understand. I feel your frustration and pain. And like I said, when we were down on Simpson Street, we were fully dedicated. I have fully dedicated all the resources to that area, and we have visited that block multiple times. We have teams down there. There's so much happening, and this is no excuse, just a reality. We jumped from blocks to block, and we weren't on that block that night. And if we were, I don't think we could have avoided that shooting from happening. But I think going forward, building relationships and trying to find out which groups are doing which, I think that will be, that will have a greater impact. So again, I feel your frustration.
I'm gonna let it go.
Councilman Jones, for the sake of time, I have to wrap up, sir.
I'm gonna let it go, sir. But we will revisit this. This ain't going nowhere. And this is, we have to figure out how to have sustained efforts on blocks like this.
So I'm going to ask for Shondell and Darren to follow up tomorrow for the second half of the hearing. Make yourselves available. We'll finish also talking to the other administration agencies as well. And at this particular time, as we recess for tomorrow, I want to call for a motion to adjourn to August the 12th at 9:30 a.m.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your schedule and being here for this very important special hearing on gun violence. The mayor has a press conference at 1 o'clock. That's the only reason why we have to adjourn right now. We'll come back tomorrow and get back to the business of the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.